Chapter 2419. As the small world shrank, the countless chains that were originally tightly wrapped around the small world also began to shrink crazily. It looked like a huge mountain range was smashing towards Luo Fan. These countless chains were originally condensed by the instincts of this part of the world. They were born to oppress Luo Fan into constructing such a small world. Naturally, they were constantly shrinking. It was very normal for them to behave like this. Luo Fan's expression did not change in the slightest in the face of the countless chains that were like mountains. Raising his hand and pointing towards the void, a ray of light that contained an extremely dense and profound concept shot out from his hand. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived around the chains. As he slightly trembled, all the chains collapsed and turned into powder that was devoured by the void. In the blink of an eye, they disappeared without a trace. At this moment, the concept ability condensed slightly and arrived in front of Luo Fan. It condensed into a dim light again. It looked not much brighter than the light emitted by a firefly. At this moment, the dark red river of the great path in the void began to surge. A kind of absolute malice directly appeared on the halo around Luo Fan's body at this moment, causing the halo to creak. It felt as if some kind of invisible force was crushing the halo with all its might, causing it to quickly collapse and disappear. This was the most direct hostility of heaven and earth, as well as the most direct hostility of the great Tao. At this moment, Luo Fan already felt that he was completely incompatible with this world. Everything in this world, whether it was something that he had refined or something that he was completely unfamiliar with, now treated him as an irreconcilable enemy. As expected of the instinct of the world's will, it is indeed powerful. Sensing the malice that had condensed into a substance, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, the corresponding existences in the various planes also felt this kind of malice that was emitted by all the existences in this world. However, compared to the reality plane, the malice in the other planes behaved differently. Some were extremely orderly, while others were extremely chaotic. However, it was not as balanced as the reality plane. Clearly, the main body of this malice was in the reality plane. The malice emitted by the existences in other planes that corresponded to heaven and earth was merely the malice attached to this plane of reality. When he realized this, Luo Fan instantly felt much more at ease. After all, to him, although his ability to control the corresponding existences in the other planes was not as good as his body in the reality plane, he could already control them almost perfectly. Under such circumstances, if the malice of a plane was chaotic to a certain extent, the corresponding existences in that plane could easily resist it. In this way, it was clear that no matter how strong the malice was, even if the effects of the attack had reached an unimaginable level, he still had a way out. In other words, no matter how the situation in the reality plane developed due to the malice, his life would be guaranteed. With this kind of guarantee, how could he not feel much more at ease? However, although his life was guaranteed, Luo Fan could not just watch as the malice destroyed him. After all, what he wanted this time was to transcend this world. He wanted to let his fragments in this world return to their whole body. With such a goal, how could he just stand there and wait for the world and the great Tao to take action? At this moment, in the residence of the world's will, the light of the world had already pulled back the traces of light that had been sent into a certain light shadow. Compared to when it entered the light shadow, the traces of light were slightly dimmer. It seemed to have suffered some unknown damage. After the light returned to the light of the world, it completely fused with the light of the world with a slight ripple. It became one with the light of the world again, and the dimness was naturally eliminated. Clearly, the damage it had suffered had been completely recovered in an instant. Then, the world's light trembled again. As it trembled, the residents of the worlds will began to violently tremble. The originally extremely stable space began to distort violently, as if some kind of strange paper had begun to distort under the influence of an external force. At the same time, the many light shadows that had been slightly lifted also began to distort indescribably. As the distortions occurred, some light shadows randomly pieced together, some directly shattered, turning into even more fragments, and some intertwined with other light shadows, as if they were weaving a strange hemp rope. Due to the strange changes of these lights and shadows, the laws of this world underwent countless complicated and strange changes. Every place seemed to be undergoing some kind of strange transformation. The ground suddenly turned upside down, birds suddenly swam underground, earthworms flew in the air, trees grew upside down, their roots grew on the ground, and branches and leaves extended into the ground. All sorts of scenes that overturned the understanding of living beings filled the entire world in an instant. If it was normal, there would definitely be living beings who would find it absurd and unbelievable. But at this moment, not a single living being in this world paid any attention to these changes. Or perhaps it could be said that even their wills and knowledge have been distorted by this abnormality. Not a single one of them felt that this was abnormal, and not a single one of them felt that this was absurd. A huge vortex gradually appeared above the long river of the Great Path. Compared to living beings, this vortex was naturally huge. Even the nine-headed lion that Duan Shur had transformed into seemed insignificant compared to this vortex. However, this was only relative to living beings. Compared to the long river of the great Tao that traversed the heavens and the earth and almost completely covered the entire sky, this whirlpool seemed incomparably small. It floated above the long river, and even Luo Fan had almost overlooked it. From afar, the vortex looked as tiny as a sesame seed on a huge planet. From afar, the vortex looked like an eye that slowly spun above the long river of the Great Path. It vaguely gave off a feeling that it controlled and overlooked everything. This was the will of heaven and earth. If living beings who knew about the existence of the will of heaven and earth saw this vortex, they would immediately know this. Compared to the normal will of heaven and earth, the vortex had a light that was different from the previous will of heaven and earth. It was a light that could not be described with words. It was a light that seemed to contain all the colors in the universe, yet also seemed like no color existed. It was a light that was like a living thing. It was the light of heaven and earth. The moment the vortex appeared, the dark red color above the long river of the Great Path started spreading in all directions from the point where the vortex was perpendicular to it. Gradually, it began to fade. Vaguely, it showed signs of returning to the original color of the Great Path. A faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face when he saw this. Instincts and willpower are closely connected. My light of heaven and earth has already become the will of heaven and earth. So how can it be so easily isolated by instincts? This thought flashed through his mind. His body directly charged up into the sky against the boundless and terrifying malice. The malice was so strong that it even distorted space-time and messed up the rules and laws. As he charged up, countless terrifying movements began to appear around Luo Fan. Thunder, wind, ghost cries, godly cries, the sound of hard objects breaking, and even all sorts of terrifying movements that could not be described with words appeared around him at this moment. They accompanied him as he charged up the great path above. At this moment, the nine-headed lion, the demon army, and the golden-armored war god, who had regained some of their clarity, all seemed to be guided by something at the same time. They pounced towards Luo Fan in a frenzy. With this pounce, an endless world was created. The entire world began to shake violently under this pounce. It felt as if the world was turning upside down and the stars were moving. Space-time completely collapsed at this moment. The ground completely turned into powder and spread in all directions like a violent gale. Boundless and terrifying light was released from the nine-headed lion, the demons, and the golden-armored war god. Among them, the light from the nine-headed lion was mixed with extremely dense concepts and mysteries, causing the light it released to be tens of times stronger than the light released by the other two parties. It even oppressed the light released by the other two parties to the point of shaking. Currently, the three parties were no longer surrounded by killing intent and karma. Their attacks were less sinister, and instead, they had a grand atmosphere. As it pressed down on Luo Fan, it was as if the power of the entire world was fiercely pressing down on him. The area within a radius of hundreds of millions of light years had been completely turned into powder in an instant. All the power, all the things that could be squeezed out, and even the phenomena had been completely turned into power. Along with their attacks, they fiercely pressed towards Luo Fan. This kind of fierce pressure wasn't just a simple pressure of strength. There were also countless mysterious and indescribable impacts from all aspects. Under this impact, Luo Fan not only felt his body being oppressed, but his own strength, his own might, his own mind, and even his own willpower and thoughts were under an incomparably astonishing pressure. Even a miniature world that had turned into a circle of light could not stop all the pressure. There was still a lot of pressure that penetrated the miniature world and directly affected him. Faced with this kind of attack, Luo Fan did not even look over. With just a thought, streams of divine power penetrated the light's circle, split into billions of parts, and fiercely penetrated the light that was pressing down on him from all directions at this moment. All the profundities within the light, including the profundities of concept that were the trump cards of era severing, were directly crushed by the wisps of concept ability. As the mysteries were defeated, the countless powers became simple. Those concept divine abilities were just aftershocks, but they had already eliminated all of his power, turning his surroundings into a void. The boundless light, impact, pressure, and even the silhouettes brought about by the power and profundities had all disappeared without a trace. Apart from the circle of light on Luo Fan's body, after erasing these attacks, Luo Fan didn't even bother to pay attention to Duan Shi and the others. He didn't even have the intention to erase them along with him. He raised his hand, and the countless concept divine powers he had released before condensed in his hand. Throughout the process, there was no light at all. There was not even a trace that appeared like before the abilities were released. It felt like the concept abilities had vanished in a thin air after all the power and mysteries had been erased. It was as if they had appeared out of thin air, or as if Luo Fan had recreated them. Although Duan Shi and the others had been completely affected by the natural instincts of the world, their battle experience and battle instincts were still present. After their attacks were erased, they instinctively began to defend themselves in an attempt to completely block the impact that came with the erasing process. However, what they waited for was not an attack. Instead, it was a figure that disappeared before their eyes, disappearing from their line of sight. A figure that charged into the sky and into the long river of the Great Path. This situation of making countless movements and unleashing countless powers to block the attacks coming at them, but failing to do so made the three of them look rather comical. On the contrary, the destructive aura from before was completely swept away, and a dazed atmosphere filled the vast region that spanned hundreds of millions of light years. Amidst the daze, the three parties suddenly regained a little clarity. What just happened? Were we ignored? The demon ancestor murmured with disbelief in his eyes. He knew very well how powerful the power that he had gathered with the demon race was. It could be said that even if Duan Shi was right in front of him, he would definitely be able to erase him immediately if he had the chance. But just now they were ignored. The enemy didn't even have the interest to use their own methods to erase them. How could he react to such an encounter? Chapter 24:20. Master, the martial ancestor beast could not help but be curious. The incident was extremely unjust to the martial ancestor beast. Who was controlling him? Who was his enemy? And why was there a conflict? Everything was a mystery to him. Since the beginning, he had been like a marionette being manipulated into a battle that he did not understand at all, lingering on the line between life and death time and time again. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine how many questions he had. At this moment, after listening to Duan Shi's words, he finally grasped some clues about the cause of the battle. How could he not be bothered? At that moment, he hurriedly asked, "The teacher you mentioned, is he our enemy?" Hearing this, Duan Shi's lion head turned around, and looked at the demon ancestor with a probing gaze. He said calmly, "If I'm not wrong, it should be him." Duan Shi was considered a legendary figure in this world. Ever since the first great tribulation of the heavens and earth, he had gone through eras after eras, tribulations after tribulations, and upheavals after upheaval of the heavens and earth, but he had always stood firm. Furthermore, his achievements had become greater and greater, and in the end, he had reached a level that ordinary cultivators could only dream of. Many cultivators were extremely curious about such an existence. Among them was the martial ancestor beast. The martial ancestor beast immediately asked, "I've never heard that Senior has a master. Can you tell me more about it? After all, Senior's master is now our enemy." Duan Shi's gaze became complicated. Regarding Luo Fan, his feelings were naturally quite complicated. As for Luo Fan's gratitude, he naturally kept in mind. However, at the same time, after experiencing so many changes recently, the seed of doubt that was planted in his heart gradually pointed toward Luo Fan. It pointed toward his master, who had always held a supreme position in his heart. Due to the doubt, his gratitude toward Luo Fan had unknowingly wavered. Although it still existed, it was no longer as absolute as it used to be. With such mixed emotions, how could his current mood not become complicated? I wonder if you've heard of the origin of techniques? Duan Shi let out a sigh and asked in the end. Hearing this, the beast progenitor shuddered and wore a look of disbelief. To him, the source of the technique was a supreme existence that only existed in ancient myths and legends. It was said that a long time ago, before the first great calamity of the world, this existence had preached the great Tao to all living beings in the world. It could be said that all the cultivation methods and magical powers in this world had traces of the great Tao that he had preached. It could be said that it was the existence known as the origin of the technique that created the foundation of cultivation in this world. For a long time, the demon ancestor had been doubtful whether such an existence really existed. In fact, he was more inclined to believe that the current cultivators were merely trying to find a source for all techniques, just like the legendary creation of the world. However, he did not expect that he would hear the name of a legendary figure from the mysterious Duanji in front of him. How could he not be shocked? Could it be that the source of the technique really exists? How is this possible? How could there be such an unbelievable expert in this world? The demon ancestor could not help but exclaim. As he exclaimed, he almost lost control of his mind. He almost fell into the control of the heaven and earth's instincts and lost himself again. Fortunately, the heaven and earth's instincts were no longer focused on them. The influence on him was extremely weak, which allowed him to regain control of his mind at the last moment and stabilize the freedom of his mind. Even so, he broke out in a cold sweat from the shock. Even though there were countless living beings, beasts, and wild beasts in the surroundings, the martial progenitor and Duan Shi were the only ones there. That was because apart from them, all other living beings were controlled by the heaven and earth's instincts. At this moment, they were only there because they were born to be the leaders of the wild beasts and the demons. Their control over the two races was also recognized by the heaven and earth's instincts. It was because their identity and status were recognized by the heaven and earth's instincts. Therefore, if the two of them did not plan to do anything, the two races would naturally not do anything. Duan Shi sneered when he heard the demon ancestor's disbelief. You're ignorant. Even in your past life, you were taught by teacher of the technique source. Strictly speaking, you should call him teacher. The demon ancestor's expression froze when he heard that. He said, No, I've clearly recovered the memories of my past life. I was just an ordinary cultivator in my past life who died in a great calamity. I've never heard of the technique's source back then. That's because you didn't dig deep enough. If you dig a few thousand more lives, you'll definitely be able to dig out the memories of the lectures. I still remember that you were just a rogue immortal back then. You were the weakest among the cultivators who attended the lectures. You could only listen at the corner of the door, said Duan Shi. Is that so? The demon ancestor finally realized how long Duan Shi's history was. He did not think Duan Shi would lie to him because there was no need for it. Duan would never do something like that either. Since Duan mentioned that he had attended the lectures of the technique source in his past life, he must have attended the lectures there. I see. It seems like I've underestimated myself. The demon ancestor let out a sigh. For cultivators, their past lives were a part of them too. Therefore, they would usually try their best to retrieve the memories of their past lives. The demon ancestor was no exception. When he had the ability, he had already started to trace back to his past life. Through repeated efforts, he managed to retrieve his memories. Later on, he dug deeper into his past life in an attempt to dig out more memories of his past life. Unfortunately, to him, the only thing he could learn was his past life. As he dug deeper, he realized that he was no longer a cultivator. He was just a mortal. Even if he could transform, he would turn into a beast or a plant. He had a lifespan of tens of thousands of years in his past life. In other words, a lifespan of tens of thousands of years was only one life. However, in the previous life, there was a life every few decades. Tracing back to tens of thousands of years, there were hundreds of lives. Because of that, after tracing back hundreds of lives, he felt that it was a waste of time, so he stopped digging. After all, to him, digging out the memories of each life was not only a gain, but also a burden. If he could dig out some beneficial cultivation experiences, it would naturally be a good thing. However, the memories that came one after another were the memories of the mortal world. If he dug them out, he would only be looking for trouble. Perhaps I should continue digging. What kind of Tao is the Tao that the technique's source talks about? He mumbled with an inexplicable look of anticipation on his face. For him, who was already a false sage, it was not difficult for him to dig out the memories of his past life. However, it was obvious that it was not a good time. After all, he was only able to maintain his consciousness because of his firm will and the fact that the heaven and earth did not care about him. Under such circumstances, digging out the memories of his past life was obviously provoking the heaven and earth's instinct. Naturally, he would not do such a stupid thing. Since he could not dig out his own memories to find out about the technique source, he could only start from Duan, who obviously had memories. He immediately asked, since he's the technique's source, why did teacher become the heaven and earth's enemy? Hearing that, Duan sighed. He raised his 9 lion heads and looked at the great path that covered the sky. After a long time, he said, I don't know either. However, teacher seems to be quite wary of the heaven and earth. There was even a period of time when he hid deep in the void and was unwilling to come out. Perhaps the conflict between him and the heaven and earth has finally reached a point where it can no longer be suppressed. The demon ancestor was a little confused, but he also came to a realization. He did not ask any further and raised his head to look at the sky. At that moment, the void around them had completely turned into nothingness. Even the rules and laws had completely disappeared. It felt like they had directly arrived at the void in the depths of the void. The vastness of this region of nothingness had reached an inconceivable level. It covered an area of hundreds of millions of light years. At a glance, it seemed like they had appeared in the void of the universe and were facing an incomparably huge river above them. A feeling of insignificance arose in their hearts. With such a mentality, none of them dared to rush up to help, even though the great path above them had begun to churn and change. As for the gold-armored war god, he seemed to have turned into a statue again. He quietly hovered there and did not even raise his head. Naturally, it was impossible for him to rush up and join the battle. Luo Fan did not look at the reactions of the 3 parties below, nor did he care. Under the current level of the battle, the 3 parties had become insignificant. Even if they gave their all and sacrificed everything, it would still be difficult for them to break through the barrier of the aftermath of the battle and participate in the battle between him and the heaven and earth's great path, or rather, the heaven and earth's instincts. At this moment, his body had already fiercely penetrated the great path above him and charged towards the vortex formed by the light of the world above the great path. The great path was extremely mysterious. It contained endless information and endless mysteries. It even contained the mysteries of all the laws that existed in this world. And all of this was not only constantly crushing towards Luo Fan under the guidance of the heaven and earth's instincts, but even the great path's repulsive force towards all foreign objects was constantly pressing towards him. At this moment, the more he charged up, the more terrifying the resistance became. Moreover, countless cracks continuously appeared on the halo of light around him, causing cracks to appear one after another. If it was not for his concept god art that was constantly mending these cracks, perhaps his world would have already collapsed before he could reach the depths of the Great Path. At this moment, beams of light shot out from the vortex formed by the light of the world above him. They formed countless threads that smashed downwards and smashed into the Great Path. They continuously approached Luo Fan, who had already reached the depths of the Great Path. The Great Path only produced circles of ripples when it faced the impact of Luo Fan. Even the pressure that appeared was only naturally produced by the parts of the Great Path that came into contact with him. However, under the impact of the light rays that shot down from the vortex, the Great Tao itself began to stir violently. It felt like a python had swallowed a prey that was larger than its body. From a spot where the light rays penetrated, the Great Tao began to bulge outwards. At this moment, what was produced on the Great Path was no longer circles of ripples. Instead, what appeared was pieces after pieces of the Great Path. The Great Path was an extremely mysterious existence. Time, space, matter, energy, and everything else would be controlled by the Great Path. Under such circumstances, it was obviously impossible to move through time and space and use all kinds of strange magical powers to bypass the obstruction of the Great Tao and arrive behind the Great Tao. After all, even an existence like Luo Fan didn't have the right to say that his abilities could surpass the profundities of the Great Path. Under such circumstances, regardless of whether it was space-time or the various divine abilities, they were obviously unable to avoid being affected by the Great Path. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan had chosen to forcefully charge into the Great Path and charge towards the light of the world above him. Of course, converging was one reason, and attacking the Great Path was also another reason. In order to surpass this world, it wasn't enough to just leave this world. Instead, he had to make this world submit to him and make the energy of this world truly serve him. It wasn't that he could use it in this world, but that he could still use it after he left this world. Only in this way could this world allow him to exist safely after he left. At the very least, this was the case for the worlds that the fragments encountered during the Great Calamity. After all, to him, the baleful aura of the Great Calamity was not much inferior to the state of chaos. Chapter 24-21. It wasn't an easy task to make the Great Tao yield. At the very least, in the past, Luo Fan wouldn't have dared to have such ambitions, even if it was a great thousand world. However, the situation now was completely different. Although he was facing a perfect replica of the world, which was tens of thousands of times stronger than the Great Thousand World. However, Luo Fan now had the light of heaven and earth, which possessed the will of the world. The will of the world within the light of heaven and earth was an existence on the same level as the will of the world in the perfect world. Such an existence was already extremely effective against the Great Tao in the first place. Even if the light of heaven and earth collided with the Great Tao, there was an extremely slim chance of victory. Not to mention that Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth had already completely replaced the will of the world. He had complete control over everything in the world, apart from his instincts. With such confidence, the light of heaven and earth would naturally have an advantage against the Great Tao, and the chances of victory would naturally be greater. The Great Tao's reaction to the existence that invaded it was extremely intense. Right now, it wasn't just the Great Tao that had been invaded that reacted to Luo Fan. The entire Great Tao was releasing endless power, and mysteries that constantly crushed towards Luo Fan, as well as the countless strands of light that were hammered down by the light of heaven and earth. To the two of them, the power, and mysteries were extremely great threats. At every moment, Luo Fan felt that he was facing an endless world. It was as if everything outside of his body was attacking him. At this moment, there wasn't much of a reaction from the living beings below. At most, the more powerful beings would look up at the sky out of habit and look at the great chaos that covered the sky and earth. The space-time in this world was already extremely distorted, and the originally chaotic scene didn't calm down at all. Instead, it became even more intense and terrifying. At a glance, the entire world seemed to have lost its order. It had completely turned into a strange light and shadow that was randomly mixed together by the four basic existences of space, time, matter, and energy. If it wasn't for the fact that the chaos wasn't complete enough, or that the great Tao of the world still placed a bit of hope on the living beings of the world, perhaps even the living beings of the world would have been corroded by the chaos that had lost order, assimilated, and become a part of the chaos. Under this change, the world seemed to have become an incomparably huge river of the Great Path. It carried endless chaotic light and shadow as it fought against a certain creature that had invaded the Great Path, as well as the vortex formed by the light of the world that floated above the Great Path. The once flourishing civilization and countless cultivators seemed to have disappeared without a trace at this time. As the light of heaven and earth got closer and closer to Luo Fan, the attack produced by the Great Path became stronger and stronger. In the end, at a certain moment, this attack finally broke through a certain realm, and even the halo of light formed by the world around Luo Fan could no longer resist it. All the cracks broke through their limits in an instant, causing the halo of light to collapse in an instant. I finally can't hold on anymore. Seeing that the miniature world was still collapsing even with the support of his concept ability, Luo Fan could only sigh. As he sighed, the boundless might of the great Tao had already slammed into his body. His body collapsed in the blink of an eye, completely turning into nothingness. Not even a single trace of him remained. He had completely and utterly disappeared without a trace. At this moment, the vortex formed by the light of heaven and earth suddenly trembled, showing signs of collapsing. However, very soon, the light of heaven and earth erupted with intense light once again. The light that had been swaying due to the trembling of the vortex and seemed like it was about to collapse once again strengthened at this moment. However, this time, these rays of light weren't heading downwards towards the direction that Luo Fan was originally charging towards. Instead, they began to spread out like a net, spreading out in all directions. They continued to penetrate deep into the great Tao, inserting themselves into the endless mysteries, principles, and even power of the great Tao. The dark red luster on the Great Path started to weaken rapidly during this process. This weakening speed was not fast, but it was extremely determined. It was a gradual and thorough change. The range of this change corresponded to the range of the net formed by the light of heaven and earth. Wherever the net spread, the light of the Great Path would also spread. Teacher 1. At that moment, the nine-headed lion's 9 heads were filled with shock and bewilderment at the same time, where the Great Path's luster had changed. He could no longer see Luo Fan at all. He had no idea what Luo Fan was doing or how far his battle with the world had progressed. However, from the changes in the great Tao and the weakening of his control over his spirit, he suddenly had a thought that he had never dared to imagine before. Perhaps his teacher had already achieved victory in the battle against the heavens and earth. After all, compared to the dark red Great Path, the Great Path that had changed its luster seemed more peaceful and more in line with the Great Path that he had imagined. Under such circumstances, how could he not suspect that the other side in the battle with the Great Path had already won? At this moment, great changes were also happening on many other planes. In some of these planes, the existences that Luo Fan corresponded to were also annihilated by the existences that corresponded to the Great Path. They were turned into nothingness, and not even a single trace of them remained. However, on an extremely small number of planes, due to the characteristics of the planes and the depth of Luo Fan's control over the existences that corresponded to him, The existences that corresponded to him could still survive the attacks of the existences that corresponded to the Great Path. In fact, they even went one step further and broke through the barriers of the Great Path. They arrived in front of the vortex above and overlapped with it. As the existences that corresponded to Luo Fan in a certain plane overlapped with the existences that corresponded to the light of heaven and earth, in many other planes, including the plane of reality, in the vortex formed by the light of heaven and earth, a figure materialized at the same time. In the plane of reality, this figure was Luo Fan's body in the plane of reality. In the other planes, this figure was the figure that corresponded to Luo Fan's existence in the plane of reality. As this change occurred, the Great Path started to tremble violently. The hostility that had slightly weakened just now instantly skyrocketed again. Moreover, in the blink of an eye, the hostility had skyrocketed to a state that far surpassed the state that Luo Fan's body was in before it was destroyed in the plane of reality. In fact, it wasn't just twice, but 10 times, or even 100 times. Duanshi and the demon ancestor, who were below, instantly felt that the bit of clarity in their hearts had instantly crumbled. The moment the clarity in their hearts crumbled, they let out roars and led countless living beings to charge upwards. They charged towards a great Tao. Or to be more specific, they were charging towards the vortex above the Great Path. Because the hostility was even stronger, even if the Great Path did not control them instinctively, they could no longer bear it and could no longer maintain their sense of self. Luo Fan naturally did not care about all these changes. At this moment, although the hostility that he encountered was 10 times or even 100 times stronger than before, he was much more relaxed than before due to the protection of the light of heaven and earth. At this moment, his expression was still calm as he looked at the backlash below. With a slight thought, the light of heaven and earth reacted and split into more threads that plunged downwards, forming a net that spread in all directions at an even faster speed. The area that had changed its color became wider and wider, and the color became more and more similar to the light of heaven and earth. As this change occurred, the Great Path itself began to distort intensely. The dark red Great Path outside began to reject the Great Path that had changed its color. A strange distortion appeared at the boundary between the two, causing both sides to violently tremble. Countless tiny cracks appeared on the Great Path, as if both sides could collapse at any time. However, as the silk net continued to spread, this boundary was also constantly pushing outward. It looked quite strange. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan showed a faint smile on his face. If this situation continued, although he was still a long way from the final victory, he was at least on the right path. Under his command, the light of heaven and earth that had turned into a vortex began to slowly descend, constantly approaching the incomparably huge Great Path River. Vaguely, Luo Fan seemed to sense that the will of heaven and earth within the light of heaven and earth seemed to be rather agitated. Of course, this feeling was extremely vague, and he couldn't even be sure if it was really agitated. After all, even the will of heaven and earth within the light of heaven and earth was still the will of heaven and earth. Its level was much higher than the will of heaven and earth of heaven and earth. Such a will, its way of thinking, and its emotional reactions were all fundamentally different from that of a living being. Under such circumstances, his perception of the will of heaven and earth's emotions could only rely on his previous understanding of the will of heaven and earth to guess, for the light of heaven and earth and the Great Path, an existence like time was merely an attribute that could be changed at will. In what seemed like an instant, but also like tens of thousands of years later, the vortex formed by the light of the heavens and the earth had already arrived above the long river of the Great Path and slowly merged with it. As this change occurred, the will of heaven and earth within the light of heaven and earth began to vibrate intensely. An indescribable suction force began to appear, acting directly on the surrounding Great Path. The net formed by the surrounding rays of light was like countless hands that began to pull in the surrounding mysteries of the Great Path and absorb them into the light of heaven and earth and the will of heaven and earth. As the mysteries of the Great Path were integrated, the originally illusory will of heaven and earth began to give birth to bits of substance. Countless tiny threads continuously emerge from within the light of heaven and earth. Not only were these threads extremely vague at first, but they were also intermittent and intertwined with each other, appearing extremely chaotic. However, this change alone was enough to make Luo Fan feel that the essence of the light of heaven and earth had obtained some kind of incomprehensible sublimation. It felt as if the light of heaven and earth had walked out of nothingness and possessed some indescribable reality. How could there be such a change? Even Luo Fan couldn't help but be shocked by this change. Although he had condensed the light of heaven and earth bit by bit, his level was still too low compared to the will of heaven and earth. However, his level was still too low compared to the will of heaven and earth after all. Therefore, he had no idea what the light of heaven and earth would evolve into, or what the light of heaven and earth would desire in the future. He didn't expect that the light of heaven and earth would actually undergo such an unbelievable sublimation after devouring a bit of the Great Path. This effect almost completely overturned his understanding of the light of heaven and earth. If I had known that I could devour the Great Path to grow, would I have needed to scheme so much? After a long time, he couldn't help but feel an indescribable sense of helplessness. The light of heaven and earth had already gained the right to come into contact with the Great Path a long time ago. If he had known that the light of heaven and earth could devour the Great Path to grow and even sublimate, why would he have needed to plan so much, calculate so much, and waste so much time? If he had thrown the light of heaven and earth onto the Great Path and allowed it to devour the Great Path completely, wouldn't this world be like his backyard, where he could transcend if he wanted to? Xian lamented for a long time. In the end, Luo Fan sighed and got rid of all these distracting thoughts. It didn't matter if he regretted it or not. For now, the past was the past. The most important thing now was to let the light of heaven and earth devour the Great Path as much as possible. Either he could devour the Great Path completely, or he could let the light of heaven and earth grow to the limit of its growth through devouring the Great Path. With a thought, he immediately began to work hard to control the light of heaven and earth to spread out more and more threads, making those threads spread out as much as possible. The Great Path was an extremely mysterious existence. It wasn't tangible, nor was it illusory, nor was it half real and half illusory. In it, all the mysteries contained in the Great Path could evolve into all kinds of unimaginable things. Time, space, matter, energy, rules, laws, and even the world, heaven and earth, not to mention living beings. Chapter 24-22. Such a situation was countless times more mysterious than the rejection and pressure from the spontaneous reaction of the Grand Tao from before. The reason for this was simple. Even though the great Tao had been eroded and repelled him, it was still just like how ordinary living beings repelled existences they hated. No matter how strong the rejection was, it could only resist with a portion of a living being's power. But the situation was completely different now. Luo Fan was using his world light to devour the Grand Tao. For the Grand Tao, it was equivalent to a knife slicing its windpipe. The pressure of being on the verge of death was enough to make the Grand Tao unleash all of its potential. It was just like how a person's struggle before death was usually the strongest. However, Luo Fan no longer had the mood to care about the current situation. At this moment, he was wholeheartedly resisting the Grand Tao's struggle, resisting the unimaginably terrifying pressure. Even with the world light protecting him, he could still clearly feel the changes being produced by the Grand Tao at every moment, which were tens of thousands of times more intense than usual. All these changes intertwined and formed a violent effect that impacted his cultivation achievements. It caused his worldview, his concept, his divine abilities, his sense of self, and his life essence to be constantly shaken. It was imaginable that if it wasn't for the world light protecting him, even if he didn't completely lose himself, his body and mind would be greatly damaged. Even the worldview that he had spent a great deal of effort to sort out would be shaken. However, this difference was enough to completely overturn the entire situation. Now that he had the protection of the light of the heavens and earth, and the light of the heavens and earth became his last source of confidence, he was able to maintain his clarity during this process. In the end, he began to absorb and fuse the various mysteries revealed by this change bit by bit. In the end, it strengthened and perfected his worldview of laws. During this process, the light of the heavens and the earth constantly split into threads and expanded the network. The speed at which it devoured the great path also increased. At this moment, Duanshi, the demon ancestor, the many demons, and the golden armored war god that was formed in the human space had all charged into the Grand Tao. They were instinctively supported by the great path. Although they were foreign objects, they had a strong affinity with the great path around them. Under this kind of affinity, they didn't encounter any obstructions when they entered the great Tao. Instead, it allowed the great Tao to facilitate their advance. When their bodies collided with the net formed by the light of the universe, they were already covered in a huge amount of smoke. Endless destructive power flowed out of their bodies and fused with the surrounding smoke. They followed the smoke and frantically collided with a net formed by the light of the universe. At this moment, a strange sound was constantly emitted from the point of contact between the two. The sound was so strange. Even though the entire world was in a state of chaos, it was still so obvious and clear. Moreover, any living being that heard the sound would naturally have an extremely strong image in their hearts. It was as if they had seen the entire process of the smoke colliding with the threads that devoured the Grand Tao with their own eyes. Meanwhile, Luo Fan, who was floating in the vortex of the light of the universe, was sitting cross-legged with a calm expression. His tightly shut eyes didn't change at all. It felt like he had turned into a strange statue. He didn't react at all to the light of the universe's actions and the impact of the light of the universe's network. After the smoke around the living beings collided with the light of the universe's net, it didn't affect the net at all. Instead, the smoke started to collapse, and in the end, it was reflected on the living beings, causing them to collapse and perish. When the confrontation between the two reached its peak, the impact had already spread to every world on the nine-headed lion that Duanshi had transformed into. It had even spread to the countless demons and every living being in the human space. Soon after, an earth-shattering and terrifying crisp sound rang out of nowhere. The living beings that were affected by the impact completely collapsed in an instant. They turned into powder and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. As they dissipated, the smoke and endless power that were originally their foundation lost its support. It could no longer resist the light of the universe's network. Under the impact of the light of the universe, it rapidly declined and completely collapsed in a short while, disappearing without a trace. After the living beings that were controlled by the hostility were completely destroyed, the changes of the Grand Tao finally affected the many light figures below, affecting all the living beings within. The entire world, which was already chaotic, instantly became even more chaotic. There were even some spots where the chaotic light had completely collapsed, turning into nothingness from the inside out. Then, as if they had never existed, they disappeared without a trace. However, Luo Fan didn't sense any of this at all. At this moment, his worldview finally showed visible growth for the first time in a long time. The benefits of the devouring Grand Tao were mostly taken away by the light of the universe. However, Luo Fan was the master of the light of the universe after all. In the end, he still had the ability to forcefully dig out some benefits from the light of the universe's teeth. To him, this little bit of benefit was already an unimaginably huge harvest. The Grand Tao was an extremely mysterious existence. Comprehending the Grand Tao and devouring Grand Tao were completely different from comprehending or devouring other objects. If it was other ordinary objects, such as heavenly treasures, comprehending the Grand Tao was to comprehend some of the principles and mysteries contained in the heavenly treasures. Once comprehended, these principles and mysteries would naturally belong to the person. Unless the memory of the comprehension was completely erased, the comprehension could not be erased no matter what method was used. Devouring, on the other hand, was to directly devour the heavenly treasures and obtain the body of the heavenly treasures without obtaining the principles and mysteries contained in the heavenly treasures. For the Grand Tao, comprehending and devouring were fundamentally different from ordinary objects, such as heavenly treasures. For the Grand Tao, comprehending and devouring were equivalent to copying a book. No matter how much you copied, no matter how well you copied, it didn't mean that you could completely learn the principles recorded in the book. Of course, this didn't exclude the fact that there were a few people with strong learning abilities who could learn the principles in the book through this method. In fact, it didn't exclude people who could comprehend some principles far beyond what was recorded in the book through analogy. However, devouring the Grand Tao was different. Devouring the Grand Tao was equivalent to directly devouring the principles recorded in the book and directly integrating them into one's heart. Naturally, it was equivalent to directly obtaining all the principles in the book. It was precisely because of this that in the past, no matter how many times Luo Fan comprehended the Grand Tao, no matter how much time he spent to deeply comprehend the Grand Tao, it was equivalent to scratching an itch through his boot. He couldn't obtain the true essence of the Grand Tao at all. At the very least, with Luo Fan's current realm, he couldn't obtain the true essence of the Grand Tao at all. In contrast, he directly used the light of heaven and earth to devour the Grand Tao. Even if he only obtained a little bit of the Grand Tao that leaked out from the light of heaven and earth, it was already an extremely huge improvement compared to the past. What he obtained was far from what he had obtained by directly comprehending the Grand Tao in the past. Luo Fan's worldview relied on this process to slowly absorb nutrients from the Grand Tao. Many of its imperfections and flaws were perfected and made up for bit by bit. While Luo Fan was completely immersed in the process of resisting the pressure of the Grand Tao and the endless mysteries contained in it, the changes in the light of heaven and earth were also continuing. The endless threads that had just appeared in the light of heaven and earth were constantly increasing, and the originally illusory and blurry areas were constantly decreasing. All the threads became more and more realistic as time passed, and the existence that the threads ultimately formed gradually took on an outline. It was a pillar that seemed to pierce through the light of heaven and earth. It even gave off a feeling that it was going to pierce through the light of heaven and earth and extend beyond the light of heaven and earth. Of course, although it was a pillar, there were so many details on the pillar that it was no less complicated than any existence. Whether it was the Grand Tao, the concept divine ability, the worldview, or even the legendary Tao of the sage, in terms of complexity, it seemed that they could only be compared to this pillar. They couldn't suppress this pillar at all. It was precisely because of this that there was a need for such a huge number of threads to be constantly born and connected. In a situation where this world had already become so chaotic, the attribute of time no longer had any meaning. After an unknown amount of time, it seemed to have been billions of years, but it also seemed to have only been a few breaths. The dark red light on the Grand Tao that traversed the heaven and earth had completely disappeared. The entire Grand Tao had already been filled with the endless threads of light of heaven and earth. No matter where on the Grand Tao was, whether it was near or far from the center, whether it was conspicuous or hidden, a large number of threads could be found in everything. Compared to before, the current Grand Tao seemed to have been completely reconstructed from the light of heaven and earth. At this moment, the vortex formed by the light of heaven and earth had already shrunk to the extent that it only wrapped around Luo Fan's body. It looked like Luo Fan's body was emitting a faint brilliance. However, all the light of heaven and earth had been completely divided into countless threads during this process, and they were scattered throughout the entire Grand Tao. At this point, the chaos in this world, which had been maintained for an unknown amount of time, had instead started to weaken. A strange order began to slowly re-establish itself in this world. Time and space were divided again, matter and energy were reconstructed, and laws were constructed at a speed that seemed slow, but was actually extremely fast. As for living creatures, they reappeared one after another, gradually adding an unknown amount of vitality to the world. The original scene of the end of the world began to gradually fade. However, this Grand Tao didn't seem to be much different from before on the surface. However, the attribute of the heaven and earth inside was completely different from before. The entire Grand Tao revealed a charm that belonged to Luo Fan, a charm that belonged to the laws and worldview. Traces of the laws and worldview could be found at the root of the many laws and worldview. The entire Grand Tao wasn't so much the original Grand Tao as the Grand Tao, a Grand Tao that was constructed based on the laws and worldview. Evidently, although this Grand Tao could be reconstructed, everything was based on Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. The light of heaven and earth was based on Luo Fan himself, his spirit, and his comprehension of cultivation. In other words, it was based on the laws and worldview. Under such circumstances, with the light of heaven and earth as the template for the Grand Tao that was ultimately born would naturally be based on the laws and worldview. The moment the order of this Grand Tao was truly re-established, Luo Fan shut his eyes for an unknown period of time. Has it been completely devoured? This thought flashed through his mind. The reason for this was because he could already feel that the extremely terrifying pressure that the Grand Tao had exerted on him over the past few days had completely disappeared. At this moment, he only felt an indescribable sense of ease and satisfaction as he was enveloped by the light of heaven and earth. Apart from that, he didn't feel the slightest bit of discomfort. This feeling was enough to tell him that the outside world's environment had undergone a huge change. Based on the light of heaven and earth's previous actions, it was quite possible that the light of heaven and earth had completely devoured the Grand Tao. With this speculation, there was a trace of disappointment in his eyes. It was indeed a good thing that the light of heaven and earth had completely devoured the Grand Tao. It meant that he had already achieved his goal and could transcend this Grand Tao at any time, allowing this fragment to return to its original form. However, from another perspective, this was also a bad thing. This was because without the light of heaven and earth devouring the Grand Tao, it was impossible for him to devour the Grand Tao anymore. After all, the Grand Tao was an extremely mysterious existence that he still couldn't understand. Previously, he could only devour the Grand Tao by relying on the light of heaven and earth, which was also an existence that surpassed his understanding, to fight against the Grand Tao. In other words, he didn't really have the ability to devour the Grand Tao and directly seize the mysteries contained within it. Instead, it was the light of heaven and earth that helped him chew up the Grand Tao before feeding it back to him. Chapter 24-23. What a waste of such a good opportunity. Luo Fan sighed inwardly. With a thought, the light of heaven and earth around him began to flicker rapidly. As it flickered, the countless threads of light of heaven and earth that had been scattered all over the path began to rapidly shrink. As the threads shrank, the path also began to converge towards where he was. At first, the threads felt extremely difficult to shrink. Although they were still fast, they were still moving at a speed visible to the naked eye. If they continued to shrink at this speed, it would probably take tens of thousands of years for all the threads to be retracted. However, it was clear that this was only the beginning. As time passed, the threads and the path shrank faster and faster, becoming more and more exaggerated. In the end, they were so fast that they couldn't be seen with the naked eye. Looking from outside the path, one could no longer see the threads. One could only see a blurry shadow, constantly flickering. It was obvious that the speed at which the threads were shrinking was far too fast. It had already surpassed the range of what living beings and even cultivators could see clearly. As the countless threads and paths shrank, the light of heaven and earth around Luo Fan began to thicken. The vortex that was originally only a name without any substance was also rebuilt. In just a few days, the net and path that would have taken tens of thousands of years to completely shrink had completely shrunk around Luo Fan's body. It became a huge vortex that floated in the void like the sun. Compared to this vortex, Luo Fan's current body seemed extremely small. It felt like he was a speck of dust on the surface of a star. Such a size was already extremely vast, but compared to the original Great Tao, it was already billions of times smaller. The vortex spun slowly in the void, emitting mysterious fluctuations that permeated the entire world. It permeated all the laws of heaven and earth, all time and space, all matter and energy, and even the bodies of all living beings. As the waves permeated, the entire world also began to slowly shrink towards the light of heaven and earth. The laws of heaven and earth, time, energy, and everything else slowly shrank towards the vortex. It felt like the waves emitted from the vortex were like fishing lines. After being released into space, they began to hook everything that could be hooked into the vortex. Similarly, at the beginning, this kind of convergent speed was extremely slow. It was like using an ordinary fishing line to catch a whale. It was a feeling of powerlessness. However, as time passed, as more and more parts of the world entered the vortex, the hooking became faster and faster. In the end, even the light and shadows in the entire world became blurry, causing the laws of heaven and earth that had originally stabilized to distort once again. It looked as if there was an invisible giant mouth that was constantly swallowing this part of the world. The light of heaven and earth became thicker and thicker with this change. The pillar that had been condensed over the past few days also began to distort subtly. This pillar was now incomparably solid and complete. Although its surface was not very smooth, but rather rough, no one could say that this pillar was incomplete. It cannot be said that this pillar was not indomitable when taken out. However, as the world was continuously pulled into the light of heaven and earth, the pillar seemed to be under some kind of indescribable pressure. It began to undergo all kinds of indescribable changes. As a whole, the pillar began to distort subtly during this process. The distortions were not obvious at first. It only caused the various parts of the pillar to deflect slightly. On the whole, it still looked like a pillar. At most, it was a pillar that was crudely made. However, as time passed, as the light of heaven and earth devoured the world outside faster and faster, and as more and more parts of the world were devoured, the distortions on the pillar became larger and more obvious. In the end, the pillar even looked crooked and twisted. It no longer looked like a pillar. On the contrary, it looked like an existence that Luo Fan was more familiar with roots. A strange root that was as huge as a heavenly pillar that could almost support the world. Combined with the increasingly rough appearance of the pillar, the roots looked more and more solid and more realistic. Although the roots were still changing and not fixed, and even the surface was constantly changing at this moment, all the rough spots were constantly moving and undulating, but just its current appearance was already extremely extraordinary. It wasn't just their inconceivable size, but the structure of the roots, the undulations on the surface of the roots, the twisted state of the roots, and even the way they trembled contained inconceivable profundities and unimaginable principles. It felt like the root was the great Tao of a perfect world. No matter from which angle, no matter how one looked at it, even its aura seemed to contain all the mysteries in the world and the universe. It contained supreme mysteries that were enough to make all cultivators scramble for it. At this moment, the entire world seemed to be filled with endless flashes of light and shadows that were constantly flickering and shrinking. Outside the world, the existence that seemed to be in a state of chaos, but was actually a boundless great calamity, baleful chi, began to surge slightly. It continuously surged in from all directions, and the space left behind by the shrinking of the world exerted greater and greater pressure on the world. When this kind of pressure acted on the world, it instead forced the world to rush into the world at an even faster speed, causing the world to shrink even faster. If it was according to the initial time, the entire world might need tens of millions of years, in Luo Fan's opinion, to finish shrinking. However, according to the current speed of improvement, the entire world would definitely completely pour into the light of heaven and earth in less than 100 years and become a part of the light of heaven and earth. Compared to the great improvements he had obtained after absorbing the great ways, his body had expanded by many times. Now that he had absorbed the physical world, the physical space-time, the physical matter and energy, the changes to the light of the world were much smaller. His body did not expand much because of this. Only the light of heaven and earth itself became more real and condensed, and the huge root inside the light of heaven and earth became more mysterious and wondrous. What absorbed the incorporeal body was the expansion of the great Tao itself, which was composed of infinite mysteries. On the contrary, the world that absorbed the incorporeal body would not change. This kind of change, which was almost the complete opposite of common sense, was very mysterious. It made Luo Fan feel that there was some kind of indescribable comprehension in his heart. Everything in the world was decided by the great Tao. No matter how seemingly unrelated it was to the great Tao, as long as it was in this world, it was rooted in the great Tao. In this way, the light of heaven and earth that had devoured the great Tao could naturally easily suppress all resistance and backlash from the world. It could easily return everything in the world to its origin, turning it into nutrients for the light of heaven and earth's growth, allowing the light of heaven and earth to grow unimaginably. In Luo Fan's senses, time passed minute by minute. In the first few years, although the outside world was already blurry, he could still see the changes in the world. However, after more than 10 years, the speed of the changes in the outside world had far exceeded the imagination of any living creature. Even Luo Fan's eyes couldn't keep up with the changes. The light and shadow that he saw in the outside world had also changed from the originally blurry and distorted appearance of the world to an endless stream of light. The light of heaven and earth's devouring and absorption of the outside world felt like endless flowing light was constantly pouring into the light of heaven and earth from all directions, turning into nutrients for the light of heaven and earth's growth, allowing the light of heaven and earth to grow. The evolution of the light of heaven and earth had countless benefits for Luo Fan. There was naturally no need to mention the strengthening of the light of heaven and earth. At the end of the day, this could be seen as the benefits of the light of heaven and earth itself. More importantly, as the world was devoured, there were strands of profundities constantly fluctuating in the light of the world. The surging of these mysteries was naturally insignificant to the endless mysteries contained in the light of heaven and earth. However, for Luo Fan, these mysteries were already incomparably vast. After many mysteries poured into his body and mind, it made him feel that his inspiration was surging. His understanding of the world of laws was almost like the millions of years he had spent sorting out the world of laws. At every moment, he could think of endless inspiration, endless ideas to transform and perfect this world of laws. With this change, he could no longer be bothered to pay attention to everything around him. He just focused all his attention on his heart, on his world of laws, and on the sparkling mysteries. Time flew by amidst this change, and before he knew it, more than 100 years had passed. In such a day, Luo Fan suddenly felt something and shifted his attention from the depths of his heart. At this moment, the boundless darkness suppressed the endless streams of light from the outside and rushed towards the light of heaven and earth. This darkness was so grand, so vast, and had a faint aura of primal chaos. However, it was fundamentally different from the primal chaos that Luo Fan knew. It felt as if it was some kind of strange simulation. The world is about to be completely absorbed. At this moment, Luo Fan came to a realization. Clearly, this meant that this region of the world had been completely absorbed by the light of the world. What existed behind the streams of light was the boundless great calamity, evil chi outside the world. Transcend without transcending. Immediately after, another inexplicable thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. He had originally planned to borrow the power of the great Tao after taming it and borrow the power of this world to leave this world and transcend it. However, he didn't expect that the light of heaven and earth would not only completely tame the great Tao of this world, but it even went a step further and directly devoured the great Tao. Then it took the opportunity to devour the entire world. At this point, why would he still need to borrow the power of this world to transcend it? Just the light of heaven and earth alone was enough for him to transcend this world, allowing him to freely move about in the boundless great calamity, evil chi. The entire process was many times smoother than he had imagined. In fact, there was even a hint of success when the conditions were right. Just as he was immersed in his thoughts, the last stream of light had already rushed into his light of heaven and earth. Immediately after, endless darkness fiercely slammed into his light of heaven and earth. Boom, 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 boom like a boundless thunderclap. An endless hurricane instantly formed in Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, an endless and terrifying impact frantically poured into his body and mind from the light of heaven and earth, making him feel as if his body and mind were trembling crazily. So strong. As this thought flashed through his mind, Luo Fan crazily stirred up the worldview of the laws in his body. Infinite concept spirit power was constantly generated inside his body, pouring into his whole body, and even into his soul. After these concept God powers were poured in, the terrifying impact directly acted on these concept God powers, causing them to constantly tremble and even collapse. This trembling and collapse also made Luo Fan feel a rather strong impact. However, compared to the direct impact on his body and mind, this was already separated by a layer. After all, most of the impact had already been dispersed. Under such circumstances, it had finally been reduced to a range that he could bear. At this moment, Luo Fan finally had the mood to pay attention to the changes in his body. Looking at it, he couldn't help smiling bitterly. Fortunately, he didn't directly rush out of that world. Otherwise, he would have been instantly erased by the boundless great calamity, evil chi. At this moment, his body had almost completely collapsed. At first glance, his entire body seemed intact, but as long as one took a closer look, one would find that his body had already been shattered into countless dust-sized fragments. If it wasn't for the restriction of his will and the light of heaven and earth on him, his body would have completely collapsed and turned into nothingness. However, even though this was the case, his body still appeared a little blurry. The outline of his body and the borders were swiftly dispersing with countless tiny specks of dust. Chapter 24:24. In that instant, the terrifying impact from outside was clearly caused by the gap left behind by the disappearance of heaven and earth. However, it was not because the boundless ominous aura outside possessed such terrifying pressure. Very soon, after the light of heaven and earth withstood the pressure from the outside gradually decreased. Unknowingly, it had already shrunk to a point where Luo Fan could hardly feel it. Evidently, the pressure had already shrunk to the point where the light of heaven and earth could completely withstand it. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan heaved a sigh of relief. If the pressure from the ominous aura outside had maintained its previous intensity, even if he could withstand the impact just now, he would not be able to withstand the endless impact. In the end, he would not be able to withstand it. Of course, this was to be expected. It must be known that his light of heaven and earth had completely devoured everything in that world. Previously, that part of the world could already exist freely in the great calamity baleful chi without being affected. Now that the light of heaven and earth had devoured the world, it naturally had the same ability to exist peacefully in the great calamity baleful chi without being affected after recovering. Luo Fan's heart moved slightly. The fragment trembled slightly, and a subtle change occurred. "I've finally broken free from a fragment," he murmured. His eyes looked outwards, and his gaze was extremely deep. It was as if he had already seen through countless obstacles and seen countless scenes in the world. In that instant, his cultivation realm began to rise rapidly. From being restricted in that world to being in tribulation, he began to break through crazily. In the blink of an eye, he had already reached his peak, reaching the peak of a fifth tribulation expert. Although it was only a fragment, it felt as though it was comparable to his complete body. Evidently, he had completely recovered his consciousness at this moment. With this fragment as a carrier and the light of heaven and earth as a communication bridge, his consciousness in the other worlds had truly been strung together, directly assembling into his complete consciousness within this fragment. It was also because of this that his cultivation was no longer restricted by this fragment, and he had recovered to his peak state. In fact, due to the various comprehensions he received from the fragments in the various worlds, his current cultivation realm faintly surpassed that of when he was at his peak. He seemed to be undergoing some sort of indescribable breakthrough. When the consciousnesses of the fragments were strung together, everything that was happening in the fragments seemed to be happening in his consciousness. In the blink of an eye, he had gained complete control over the trillions of fragments that he had scattered across the heavens and earth. Compared to the fragment in the world where the three-eyed and four-elbows born Taoism aptitude was, the light of heaven and earth had already devoured the great path and the world, naturally transcending when the conditions were right. Although the speed of the other fragments varied, even the fastest one was still extremely far away from this step. Among them, the fastest fragment had only just reached the pinnacle of the world and had begun to faintly influence the general trend of the world. It did not even have the right to directly meet the world's will, let alone completely devour the world's will and the great path. If he continued to wait like this, he might have to wait for trillions of years before all the fragments in the world could transcend. Moreover, after experiencing the benefits of the world just now, he had already developed even more ideas. This might be a great opportunity. I can't devour the perfect world in the normal state of chaos. If I want to devour the world, perhaps I can only start from this great tribulation. As he thought of this, a faint smile appeared on his face. After all, the perfect world and the outside world existed in a state of chaos. For such an existence, not to mention its own world's will, its great path was countless times more powerful than the world that had evolved in this sixth great tribulation. If he wanted to use the light of heaven and earth to devour it, the difficulty would be tens of thousands of times more difficult than in this great tribulation. In other words, even if he could do it, how could he withstand the impact of the state of chaos after devouring the world? Just the impact of the Great Tribulation, evil chi after the world was devoured in the Great Tribulation had almost killed him. His existence had been completely erased. There was no need to mention how much stronger the true state of chaos was compared to the ominous aura of this Great Tribulation. Under such circumstances, the moment he devoured the world in the state of chaos in the outside world, the impact of the state of chaos would definitely, completely erase him. At that time, the light of heaven and earth might be severely damaged, and it would be even more impossible for his imprint to remain. Therefore, it could be said that if he wanted to devour the perfect world that truly existed in the state of chaos in the outside world, outside the Great Tribulation, he would simply be courting death with his current level. Due to these various reasons, the only chance for him to let the light of heaven and earth reap the benefits from before was clearly at this moment. Only in this great tribulation, only in the unknown trillions of worlds within the ominous aura of this great tribulation. After understanding this, his eyes shone brightly as he looked at the boundless darkness in front of him, feeling as if he was looking at a huge treasure vault. Just one world alone was enough to bring him great benefits after devouring it. And now, there were countless trillions of perfect worlds in the darkness. If he completely devoured all these worlds, how many benefits would it bring him? Will it cause my light of heaven and earth to completely evolve into something similar to a primordial origin spirit treasure? Such a crazy possibility emerged in his mind. As this crazy thought came to him, he became even more motivated. Even though he clearly knew that the possibility of this crazy thought becoming a reality was extremely small, After making up his mind moved slightly, and his will began to condense towards the fragment that had begun to affect the general trend of the world. In the blink of an eye, he felt that he had broken through layers of barriers and directly guarded his heart. He went deep into a certain realm of his heart and directly arrived in a strange world within his heart. The appearance of the born Taoism body in this world was also not the one that Luo Fan was familiar with. Instead, it looked like an octopus. The entire world was extremely strange, as it was filled with boundless seawater. In other words, the air in this world was actually already in a state as thick as seawater. In such a world, living beings that could be born and grow naturally looked like living beings in the water. Of course, compared to the average seabed, this world was after all many times wider, and its ecological structure was also many times more complicated than that of the average seabed. Among them, there were countless living beings that Luo Fan had never even imagined existed in this world, and they used various methods to create all sorts of indescribably prosperous civilizations. The fragment that Luo Fan had here naturally turned into the appearance of the born Taoism body in this world. In other words, it looks similar to an octopus. There's actually such a born Taoism body. It seems that any living being can really achieve Tao. Looking at his own fragment, Luo Fan could not help but sigh to himself. It must be known that this world was copied from the state of chaos, and it had a perfect world that truly existed as a template. The living beings that existed in this world obviously also had a real template. Since the born Taoist body in this part of the world looked like an octopus, it meant that in the state of chaos, there was also a similar creature that had become a true sage. After all, only those who were true saints, or even above, could truly create a perfect world in the state of chaos. The appearance of the born Taoism body was obviously the appearance of the true saints, or even above, who had created this world. This fragment had maintained this appearance for tens of thousands of years. In this great calamity, the flow of time in this world was obviously completely different. In the previous three-eyed, four-elbow-shaped world, Luo Fan's fragment had already passed for such a long time, but in this place, only a few 100 million years had passed. This amount of time was enough for the civilization of this world to develop to a certain peak, and it was also enough for a large number of cultivators to appear in this world. However, it was impossible for them to reach a high level. After all, the way this world developed was not much different from a normal world. It was fundamentally different from the continuous tribulations in the world with 3 eyes and 4 elbows. As for why this difference would cause the level of cultivators to be lacking, the reason was even simpler. Without the continuous tribulations, the world would not be able to give too much blessings to the cultivators in it, and it would not be able to give them too many blessings. This naturally caused the cultivators in this world to have to rely on themselves if they wanted to improve even a little bit. In contrast, in a world with 3 eyes and 4 elbows, the tribulations were continuous. In order to help living beings overcome the tribulations, the world naturally gave them endless grace, and in the end, the growth of the cultivators was naturally extremely fast. However, this was only for ordinary living beings. Currently, the fragment of Luo Fan in this world had already climbed to the level of a tribulation stage powerhouse after hundreds of millions of years. It was no weaker than the fragment in the world with 3 eyes and 4 elbows. At this moment, the fragment in this world had already reached the peak of the world. In this world, his status had reached a level where no one dared to challenge him. At this level, a single word from him was enough to cause a huge change in the world. In turn, he could affect the general situation of this world. When Luo Fan's consciousness descended into this world, boundless comprehension and power poured into his body in this world. As all of this poured in, the fragment's cultivation realm began to rise rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it broke through the boundary and stepped into the level of a second tribulation powerhouse. In the blink of an eye, it surpassed the second tribulation powerhouse and reached the level of a third tribulation powerhouse. However, at this point, its body began to tremble violently. It was as if all the connection between its cells had been wiped out, and it looked like it was going to collapse in the next instant. This situation was very obvious. The fragment could no longer withstand further breakthroughs in cultivation realm. It's a pity that it's still not a true born Taoism aptitude. Sensing the changes in his body, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. At this moment, he was extremely clear about the reason for the changes in his body. This change was not because his body was not strong enough, but because the appearance of his body was fundamentally different from the appearance of his born Taoism aptitude. After all, in terms of body strength, this fragment was not much different from the fragment that had transcended its own world. That fragment could easily withstand all of his cultivation realm and directly raise its cultivation realm to the peak of his body, or even surpass it. Clearly, if it was only limited by strength, he should have been able to achieve similar breakthroughs in this body. However, this was not the case. Right now, he had only risen to the level of a third tribulation powerhouse, but his body was already unable to withstand it and was about to completely collapse. This was clearly because the structure and appearance of this body conflicted with his comprehension of cultivation. But it's enough. With a change of thought, a strange smile appeared on Luo Fan's face again. He looked up at the sky, and his eyes seemed to pierce through endless obstacles and see the worlds while hidden somewhere in the depths of the void. The worlds while here was not fundamentally different from the worlds while in the Three Eyes and Four Elbows world. Luo Fan had already controlled the world's light to devour the Three Eyes and Four Elbows world's will, so he naturally knew where the world's will resided. Using the location of the world's will, he quickly found the location of the world's will. The instant his eyes landed on the will of the heaven and earth, the will of the heaven and earth trembled violently, and a tremendous might was released from it. A strange distortion suddenly appeared in the sky. Chapter 24-25. Such a strong reaction. Just how weak is it? Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh as he watched the changes in the void above him. He had only taken a glance at the will of the world, and it had reacted so strongly. It was as if it was about to appear and attack him. He had never encountered such a situation before. Of course, he had never used such a method to spy on the will of the world before. Perhaps this was a normal reaction of the will of the world. At this moment, a faintly discernible vortex appeared in the void. This vortex didn't exist in the eyes of ordinary living beings, but in Luo Fan's eyes, it was so real and so obvious. With a glance, he could even feel an indescribable gaze shooting out from the center of the vortex and shrouding his body. Sensing this change, Luo Fan's expression changed slightly. With a faint smile, many tentacles moved upwards at the same time. As these tentacles stretched out, boundless concept God art rushed out of his many tentacles and rushed towards the vortex above. These concept God powers had already surpassed time and laws. As soon as they appeared, they had already hit the vortex above. The vortex began to tremble slightly at this moment, and most of those concept God powers were completely wiped out and disappeared without a trace. Only a small portion of the concept God powers that were left seemed to have fulfilled some unknown conditions. They crossed the obstruction of the vortex and rushed into the center of the vortex. Through the center of the vortex, they were transmitted to the residence of the will of the world and fiercely collided with the will of the world. There was no sound or movement from this collision. As for light and shadow, there wasn't even the slightest bit of movement. Luo Fan could only feel that after his concept God powers collided with the will of the world, there wasn't any reaction at all. The will of the world had already eliminated it, and there wasn't any effect at all. It felt like the existence of the concept God powers had been directly erased. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan, who had experience dealing with the will of the world, had already understood. The will of the world was probably lacking. In other words, a portion of the world's will had left the world's will and left the residence of the world's will. No wonder his reaction was so intense. It turns out that he doesn't have the confidence. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he could not help but reveal a faint smile on his face. The nature of the concept divine ability was extremely mysterious. It was formed from the sublimation of concepts, and its nature was actually somewhat similar to the will of heaven and earth. Of course, this similarity was similar to diamond and graphite. Perhaps they were of the same nature, but due to various differences, the two were worlds apart. Under such circumstances, if the will of heaven and earth was already complete, and there were no gaps in its body at all, then when these concepts collided with the will of heaven and earth, they would not be erased. Instead, they would be directly bounced off, and even have a backlash. In turn, they would be forced by the will of heaven and earth to attack Luo Fan. However, the situation was different this time. At this moment, the will of the heaven and earth had completely erased the will of the heaven and earth. This was clearly the result of the will of the heaven and earth being unstable. Once it was stimulated, it would naturally release some of its power. After realizing this, many thoughts emerged in Luo Fan's mind. If a part of the will of the heaven and earth was missing, where was that part? This was actually nonsense. The will of the heaven and earth was the will of the heaven and earth, and this heaven and earth was equivalent to its body. The missing part of this heaven and earth could naturally only be in this heaven and earth, and it could not be outside of this heaven and earth. Since it was in this heaven and earth, there was actually no need to say where it was. The missing will of the heaven and earth in this heaven and earth must have been reincarnated into this heaven and earth and become a living creature of this heaven and earth. Or it could be the born Taoism aptitude of this heaven and earth, which was a living creature that looked like an octopus, or it could be something else. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Luo Fan had already made up his mind on what to do next. As all sorts of thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, the vortex above had already begun to react to Luo Fan's actions. At this moment, countless bolts of lightning shot down from the vortex and fiercely smashed towards Luo Fan. These bolts of lightning were so terrifying that wherever they passed, the surrounding seawater evaporated crazily, forming a region that seemed like a vacuum. Countless bubbles formed and surged in all directions, making the scene look extremely lively. These bolts of lightning seemed to have surpassed time and fiercely landed on Luo Fan's head. They frantically seeped into his body and destroyed it crazily. Boom! With a crisp sound, Luo Fan's body collapsed with a loud bang. In the blink of an eye, he had already turned into nothingness and disappeared without a trace. As he disappeared, the vortex above the void seemed to have lost its target. As it squirmed slightly, it gradually faded and finally disappeared without a trace, as if it had never existed. After a while, the various turbulence caused by the vortex completely calmed down. The countless bubbles and countless regions of vacuum seemed as if they had never appeared in the first place. When everything had calmed down, the void where Luo Fan originally stood was slightly distorted. Immediately after Luo Fan's born Taoism aptitude in this world, that octopus-like body had already been restored. It looked no different from before, still at the level of a three tribulations expert, and still as leisurely as before. However, when the worlds will had attacked him previously, he did not resist at all. Instead, he obeyed the will of the world's will and directly gave his body to the world's will, allowing the world's will to completely erase his body and even his existence in this world. This was because the world's will had already completed its goal and completely erased his existence. Therefore, the world's will in this world would naturally disappear again and return to its residence. Although Luo Fan's body and all other existences in this world had been completely erased, he still had many other worlds. However, he still had many other worlds. Although the will of the world had completely erased all of his existences in the real world, it was impossible for it to penetrate into all other planes. It was impossible for it to completely erase his corresponding existences in all other planes. This was because different worlds had different characteristics. In the end, there would still be some worlds that could not do anything to Luo Fan's corresponding existences, and Luo Fan was relying on these surviving existences that corresponded to him. Through many levels of communication, he was able to completely restore his body, spirit, strength, might, and everything else in this plane of reality. The entire process was unimaginably smooth. Things had developed as he had expected. The worlds had already disappeared after attacking once. Even if he appeared again now, the worlds would no longer care about him. Looks like the problem is not small. Seeing this, Luo Fan could not help but sigh again. Although he had already guessed that the worlds would not attack him after he recovered, he was still prepared for the possibility that the worlds would destroy him a few times. However, he had never expected that everything would proceed as he had guessed. This allowed him to understand that the will of the heaven and earth was missing much more than he had imagined. After all, if it were not for the fact that it was missing so much, the worlds would not have surrendered so easily. Looks like the worlds might have reincarnated into more than one living being, and the number might be unimaginable. However, is it because it wants to reincarnate, or because something happened? This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. This world had not experienced any great world calamity. According to Luo Fan's calculations, it would take at least 10 billion years for the great world calamity to be born. This situation was almost the complete opposite of the Three Eyes and Four Elbows world situation. In the Three Eyes and Four Elbows world, the world encountered a great world calamity not long after it was born. After the great tribulation of heaven and earth, more and more tribulations appeared one after another. After that, countless tribulations combined to form the second great world calamity. Compared to the situation in this world, this kind of situation was simply two extremes. If any living being from the previous world came here, they would definitely be moved to tears. Perhaps the reason the great world calamity hasn't appeared yet is related to the lack of the world's will. With this thought, Luo Fan immediately left the peak at the bottom of the sea and came to the place where the vortex formed by the worlds was in the air. After arriving here, he looked over, and a vast world was directly imprinted in his eyes. The ground was undulating, and strange rivers appeared in the air one after another. These rivers were different from the rivers in other worlds. In other worlds, the rivers were filled with water of all kinds and attributes. However, at this moment, the many rivers in this world were filled with gaseous substances. There were all kinds of gases of all kinds and attributes. These gases converged to form rivers that flowed continuously in the sea, and he could even see all kinds of bird-like creatures soaring in the rivers. It was as if these bird-like creatures were the fishes of this world. Apart from this strange river, all sorts of coral-like existences could be found all over the world. In particular, in the area where he was previously, the colorful corals were even denser, more beautiful, and larger than the other areas. In the boundless sea, there was an endless amount of world's origin energy. This world's origin energy fused with the seawater, or rather, it was an important part of the seawater. In the seawater, it flowed along with the waves and continuously fused with the bodies of the countless creatures in the sea. At this moment, the cultivators in this world were everywhere in this world. They either flew in the sky or burrowed into the ground, soared in the sea, or directly drilled into the ground, making this world seem extraordinarily lively. Right below him, right at the edge of where he was before, there were a huge number of living beings here. These creatures gathered around him and formed city-like existences that surrounded the mountain in the center in a three-dimensional manner. In other words, they surrounded Luo Fan himself. Almost all the people living in those cities were cultivators, and they were not ordinary cultivators, but extremely powerful cultivators. At the very least, they were cultivators who occupied the highest position in this world. In these cities, the weakest cultivator was at the Khanate Zenith Heaven realm. The strongest had even reached the Pseudo-Saint realm. If it was in the previous world, cultivators of this level were naturally nothing, and they were not of much use in the huge tower. If one wanted to complete a mission, one would need to borrow the power of other powerhouses through various means. However, In this world where even the first great calamity of the world would only descend after tens of billions of years, the standard of such cultivators was not low, and they could definitely be considered experts. Obviously, these cultivators were the source of Luo fans' confidence in ruling over this world. Outside of these cities, there were radiation circles one after another. In those circles of radiation, there were a large number of cities, or rather, countries. These cities and countries were in an orderly manner. Each city and country had a passage that connected to the central city, and even a mountain in the center, and connected to Luo Fan, who was on the mountain. The various passageways formed an extremely tight and perfect network, completely wrapping around an extremely large area of the world. The connection between them was unimaginably tight. From the structure, it could be seen how much success this fragment of Luo Fan had in managing this world over the years. If the will of the world has reincarnated, there must be something special about it. Perhaps it's time to use Providence again. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The light in his eyes began to change slightly, and the perspective in his eyes began to change into a perspective that he was extremely familiar with. The perspective of Providence. As the perspective changed, the world that he saw instantly changed. The boundless seawater disappeared, the endless cities and the infinite creatures also disappeared. What he saw was only waves of Providence, seas of Providence, and all sorts of strange images condensed from the various Providence. Such a flourishing Providence. It was indeed quite extraordinary. Chapter 24-26. The karmic luck here was so abundant that it was thousands of times more abundant than the previous world. At a glance, there were practically no gaps in the entire world, and it was filled with strands of karmic luck. Compared to the sparse and numerous strands of karmic luck in the previous world, the difference was unimaginably huge. Luo Fan had come into contact with the Tao of karmic luck in the past, and he had extremely deep attainments in this aspect. Coupled with the fact that he'd even played the role of the will of the world in his previous life, and he'd used karmic luck as a starting point to devour the grand Tao in the world, his research towards karmic luck was more than 1,000,000 times stronger than before. Under such circumstances, at this moment, the boundless ocean of karmic luck entered his eyes, and he saw something that was countless times more complicated than what he'd seen on the surface. Compared to the legends that could tell the rise and fall of dynasties and the rise and fall of emperors and generals with just a glance at karmic luck, the secrets Luo Fan saw through were countless times more abundant. It could be said that he'd seen through most of the secrets of this world with just a glance. There'll be a chance 3,000 years from now. At that time, I should be able to capture the existence that reincarnated from the will of the world. After deducing slightly in his heart, he'd already come to a conclusion. At this moment, even though he'd seen through the various secrets of the karmic luck in this world, he was still unable to find the portion of the will of the world that had reincarnated into this world. Truly, even though he knew the characteristics of the will of the world, he didn't know exactly why the will of the world had reincarnated into a living being. Since he didn't know exactly what the will of the world had done, he naturally didn't know exactly what its karmic luck looked like, so he was naturally unable to find its existence with a single glance. This was the profundity of the Tao of karmic luck. Even though he didn't know what the karmic luck of the will of the world was like after it reincarnated, there were all sorts of indescribable connections between karmic luck. These various connections caused the various karmic luck to affect each other, and if there was any special karmic luck, then it would definitely stand out at a certain moment. According to Luo Fan's deductions, that portion of the will of the world would be unable to be concealed after 3,000 years, and he would be able to see through it with a single glance. At that time, not only would he be able to find the existence of the reincarnation of the will of the heavens and the earth, he would even be able to instantly understand the objective of the reincarnation of the will of the heavens and the specific plans it had. With all these thoughts in mind, it was obvious what he should do. His figure moved slightly, and his octopus-like body curled up slightly. He was already curled up in the void, as if he had turned into a sphere. Then the power in his body surged, and his body gradually became invisible. Other than those with higher cultivation than him, no one else could discover his existence. Clearly, his strength as a third tribulation cultivator had far surpassed the cultivation world of this world. So, unless he was willing, otherwise, no existence in this world would be able to discover his presence here. From the looks of it, Luo Fan intended to directly wait here for 3,000 years. For any cultivator who had transcended the limits of their lifespans, 3,000 years was not too long of a period of time. Although Luo Fan was already in existence with the highest status in this world, a supreme being who could change the situation of the entire world with a single word, he did not rule like an ordinary person in a high position. Instead, he ruled this world in a way that was like a hands-off shopkeeper. With such a way of ruling, even if he disappeared for millions or tens of millions of years, it would not arouse the suspicion of his subordinates, let alone a few thousand years. As for Luo Fan himself, these 3,000 years were nothing to him. To him, 3,000 years was not much different from an instant, so he naturally had even more patience to wait here for 3,000 years. Time continued to flow. 3,000 years passed in the blink of an eye. Just as Luo Fan had guessed, during these 3,000 years, this world operated according to the rules he had set. There were no abnormalities, and it seemed peaceful. Even from the perspective of providence, the endless providence of this world seemed to be no different from before at first glance. It was almost as if the scene from 3,000 years ago had been moved to 3,000 years later. Found it. On this day, Luo Fan, who was hiding in the void and looking at the entire world from the perspective of providence, suddenly had a thought. His eyes narrowed, and he suddenly focused his gaze on a certain place in this world. A wave of providence was directly imprinted in his eyes. This wave of providence was extremely strange. At first glance, it seemed to be only a little different from other providence. There seemed to be no difference in essence at all. However, as long as one looked closely, they would find that this wave of providence was fundamentally different from any other in this world. Moreover, it was not a small difference, but rather a rather shocking and huge difference, enough to completely distinguish this wave of providence from all other kinds of providence. This wave of providence was unimaginably stable. Over the past 3,000 years, the position of this wave of providence had changed. Sometimes, it even merged with a certain ocean of providence, converged with the providence of a certain race, and overlapped with a certain other providence. However, after a period of time, when this wave of providence became independent again, they would find that this wave of providence was no different from before. If this was only once or twice, it would naturally not be a big deal. After all, the karmic luck that didn't change occasionally still existed in this world. However, from 3,000 years ago until now, this wave of providence had recovered nearly 1,000 times. There would not be any changes even if it interacted with other providence 1,000 times. This situation was impossible even for a false saint. In this world where no false saints had appeared before, it was difficult for Luo Fan not to connect such a wave of providence with the reincarnation of the will of heaven and earth that he was looking for. With a slight movement of his heart, Luo Fan stretched his body and once again transformed into the octopus-like appearance. Following that, his body trembled slightly. With a distortion in the void, he had already traversed a distance of hundreds of millions of light years. He arrived directly at the place where the wave of providence was rising and saw the main body that was emitting it. It was a living being that looked like an octopus. In other words, it was a living being that used the connate Tao body of this world as its own appearance. From Luo Fan's point of view, this living being was naturally rather ugly. However, from the point of view of the connate Tao body of this world, this living being's appearance was absolutely perfect. The structure of its body, its lines, its rolling posture, and even the ups and downs of the patterns on its face were all in line with the requirements of the connate Tao body of this world. It could be said that if the appearance of this living being was directly engraved, it might be enough to become the visualization template for body tempering cultivation in this world. It would become the standard reference for body transformation. Such a creature should have been able to cultivate at an extremely fast pace. It was a little exaggerated to say that it could become an immortal in a day, but it was definitely not difficult to cultivate to the level of an itinerant immortal in 10 days to half a month. However, the cultivation of this living being in front of him was completely beyond Luo Fan's imagination. It was not unimaginably high, but unimaginably low. At this moment, although this living being had some cultivation, it was only equivalent to the level of the peak of the mortal realm. There was still a huge gap between it and the immortal realm. This situation was obviously at a level that was obviously impossible under normal circumstances. After all, based on what Luo Fan saw, this living being should have existed for as long as 3,000 years. Based on the body structure of this living being that was extremely compatible with the connate Tao body of this world, this living being should have long become a connate Grand Luo after such a long time. Moreover, this was only in the 3,000 years that Luo Fan had been paying attention to. Before Luo Fan paid attention to it, this living being had probably existed for more than 300 million years. Its cultivation realm should have long surpassed the connate Grand Luo. Even false saints should not be an obstacle for it. However, now, this living being's cultivation realm was only maintained at the peak of the mortal realm. It could not even transcend life and death, and even its lifespan was limited. How could this not surprise Luo Fan? What do you want? Luo Fan appeared and directly asked the living being in front of him. This living being was slightly shocked by Luo Fan's appearance. Then, when he saw Luo Fan clearly, he could not help but turn pale with fright. He hurriedly bowed and said, "Disciple Yunzun greets the Holy Venerable." The Holy Venerable was Luo Fan's title in this world. This living being's behavior clearly meant that he had already recognized Luo Fan's identity in this world. Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned. He did not expect the reincarnation of the worlds while in front of him to be completely unaware of his identity. With a thought, he raised a tentacle and curled it slightly. The living being instantly flew towards him, and its head fell directly under his tentacle. The tentacle pressed it down. After that, all sorts of profound energy flowed through the tentacles and into the creature's head. In the blink of an eye, it had seeped into the creature's head and started to search the creature's body, consciousness, and memories. As this investigation went on, all the living being's memories were directly unfolded in his mind. This living being had already noticed his uniqueness, but he only knew that it was special. He did not know what exactly his identity was or why he was so special. All along, he had been like a lone star. No matter who he was with, that person would be unlucky. No matter what race or organization he joined, that race or organization would suffer losses very quickly. If he was unlucky, he might even be destroyed directly. Who knew how many years of hard work would be destroyed in a day? Because of this, he had initially strongly rejected joining any organization and being on good terms with any other living beings. However, what made him uncomfortable was that no matter how he deliberately avoided it, the final development of the situation would push him to be on good terms with others, or join a certain organization or a certain race without him realizing it. Sometimes he suspected that there was a hidden hand controlling everything from behind the scenes and manipulating all his encounters. He had also tried his best to search for and resist it. However, from the very beginning until now, who knew how many tens of thousands of years had passed, he had gained nothing. Everything was so natural, and everything seemed to be just a coincidence. He seemed to have unknowingly wandered between various races and organizations through all sorts of coincidences, and he had also seen one living being after another that was on good terms with him suffer misfortune or even die a violent death. He was completely helpless against all of this, and he could not change anything at all. During these tens of thousands of years, he had hardened his heart to commit suicide countless times. However, no matter what method he used, even if he destroyed himself into pieces and turned himself into ashes, he would come back to life unknowingly and return to his original appearance. It would seem as if nothing had happened, and all the torture seemed as if it did not exist at all. After experiencing this living being finally gave up and could only live as he should. He befriended other living beings over and over again, then watched as those living beings suffered misfortune and joined a race or an organization over and over again, then watched as those races or organizations were damaged or even destroyed. He really is the reincarnation of the world's will. Looking at all these memories, Luo Fan finally completely confirmed that this living being before him was Sheng Lin, whom he had spent 3,000 years searching for. He could not help but reveal a strange smile on his face. Although he sympathized with what had happened to him, he was very clear that this was the characteristic of the reincarnation of the world's will. As the world's will, although he was only a part of it, he was still the world's will. Since he was the world's will, his reincarnation in this world was equivalent to a person cutting open a part of their soul and placing it into their body, circulating it along with the body's various mechanisms. Just like that, his existence would naturally cause many parts of his body to change, and naturally, those parts would become intimate with him and cooperate with him. The entire process was basically driven by his body's instincts. As a result, there were naturally no traces to be found, and it was difficult to find any abnormalities that should have existed. As for being unkillable and being able to revive even if one's body was crushed, the reason was even simpler. As a part of the world's will, it was naturally extremely mysterious. It could be destroyed and reborn in one's body, and as long as there was nothing wrong with one's body, it was naturally impossible for it to be destroyed. Using a part of one's will to adjust the world and delay the arrival of the great calamity of the world. Is this the choice of the perfect world? After understanding that this was a part of the true world's will, Luo Fan already knew the intentions of the world's will. He could not help but sigh in admiration. Chapter 24-27. Recover your memories. Luo Fan said calmly as he looked at the extremely perfect born Taoism aptitude that completely belonged to the world before him. As he spoke, the tentacle that covered the creature's head trembled slightly. All sorts of mysterious power poured into the creature's body, directly fusing with the god's consciousness, and began to dig into the endless memories hidden in the depths of the creature's consciousness. As the powers continued to dig, the creature felt waves of information gushing out from the depths of its soul. It completely drowned its consciousness in the blink of an eye, causing its gaze to become blank and its body to become powerless, as if all its power had been sucked away. After a while, Luo Fan let go of the creature and retracted all of his powers. He took a step back and quietly watched what the perfect born Taoism aptitude would do next. The creature hovered there quietly, and its gaze gradually recovered from its blankness. Light began to gather in its eyes. You're no longer who you used to be. The creature's first sentence after its gaze gathered was beyond Luo Fan's expectations. It looked at Luo Fan like a supreme god looking down at a wriggling worm in the mud. It has the consciousness of the world's will and the thoughts of a living being's will. What a wonderful combination. It's a pity that it's still a combination that's neither great nor great. Luo Fan sighed when he saw this, and an inexplicable sense of disappointment appeared on his face. As his powers dug into the creature before him, most of the memories hidden deep within the creature's memories had been recovered. These memories had clearly allowed the creature to recognize its own nature and know that it was part of the world's will. It had even allowed the creature to see more things, and it had probably even seen through some of Luo Fan's nature. You're the enemy of the world, the creature said to Luo Fan. As it spoke, a series of muffled rumbles were heard in the sky. Amidst these muffled sounds, Luo Fan faintly felt as if the entire world was repelling and suppressing him. If he didn't have the consciousness of the whole body, he would definitely not be able to withstand this pressure and rejection. His body might even collapse and be destroyed in the process. However, it was clear that such an if did not happen. Right now, not only did his consciousness enter the fragment, but his cultivation level had also increased beyond imagination due to the descent of his consciousness. He had reached the level of a 3 calamities cultivator. Under such circumstances, although the rejection and oppression were a little uncomfortable for him, it was only a little uncomfortable. In fact, it wasn't even enough to injure him. Sure enough, I can't hide it from you. Luo Fan just smiled. At that moment, the creature frowned. Clearly, it felt that something was wrong with the situation. After all, he had already recovered the majority of his memories as the will of the world. He clearly knew just how much stronger he was compared to before, and he also understood just how powerless all the living beings in the world were before him. However, under such circumstances, the enemy of the world could actually look at him with such a gaze and treat him with such an attitude. How could he not be shocked? However, although he had recovered the memories brought by the will of the world, they were ultimately just memories. As memories, although they could let him know many things and even allow him to easily use a lot of power, they were ultimately just memories. In the end, one's power still needed to be accumulated over time to catch up. Hence, the current him was not much of a threat to the current Luo Fan. At this moment, after Luo Fan finished his sentence, his figure flickered and his many tentacles spread out, fiercely covering the creature. The creature's eyes flashed and it said, "Impudent." As it spoke, the void distorted and endless laws condensed, turning into countless chains that appeared out of nowhere around Luo Fan. They fiercely stabbed towards Luo Fan's body in an attempt to pin him to the chains. At the same time, the void trembled. Endless power and power were born out of nowhere, directly enveloping the void within a range of tens of thousands of miles. In the blink of an eye, the area seemed to have fallen into the end of the world. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan smiled faintly. The void behind him shook and a ball of light that seemed to be alive appeared out of nowhere. As this ball of light appeared, everything seemed to have been paused and came to a complete standstill. This included the chains formed by the laws, the power, and everything else that had appeared out of nowhere. The creature that was born from the will of the world instantly showed fear in its eyes. The way it looked at Luo Fan, as if he was a bug in the dust, had completely collapsed. At this moment, it clearly knew what kind of existence it was facing. Just what kind of unimaginable power did the person before it possess? However, it was clearly too late for it to think about this now. At this moment, Luo Fan's many tentacles had already wrapped around it. With a slight tremble, its body suddenly collapsed and turned into endless powder that splattered everywhere. Only an indescribable ball of light was left where the creature had originally been. At this moment, the entire world shook violently. In the void above Luo Fan's head, a huge vortex started to appear out of nowhere. An incomparably majestic, terrifying, and pressurizing aura was released from the vortex. It pressed downwards, causing the entire world to sink into a desolate state. At this moment, Luo Fan calmly raised his head and glanced at the vortex above. As he glanced over, he threw the ball of the worlds that was wrapped around by the tentacles backward and directly threw it into the light that seemed to be alive. In other words, it was thrown into the light of heaven and earth. The moment the ball of worlds was thrown into the light of heaven and earth, the vortex in the sky began to shake even more violently. As it shook, there seemed to be an intense emotion similar to anger coming from the vortex, causing the entire world to seem to be enraged. At this moment, the fragment of light of heaven and earth behind Luo Fan began to evolve rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a vortex and began to shred and devour the bit of world's will. Endless lightning appeared out of thin air and pounced towards Luo Fan from all directions. It directly filled every inch of the void around him. No matter where he looked, he could only see the extremely terrifying lightning. He couldn't even see through the lightning to see what was happening outside. The lightning was endless, covering the sky and earth as it pressed down on Luo Fan. Wherever the lightning passed, space-time would distort and laws would collapse. Even the Tao behind him would naturally make way for it. If it was used to attack other cultivators, even a false age would have to peel off a layer of skin in the face of such an attack before being able to escape. However, at this moment, Luo Fan did not show any abnormal reaction in the face of such an endless amount of lightning. In fact, he did not even glance at those lightning bolts. Just by relying on the various undulations created by the stirring of the light of the world, he easily dispersed those lightning bolts, causing them to be unable to release much power the instant they struck his body. They could not even harm his clothes, let alone his body. After an unknown period of time, it seemed like only a few breaths, but it also seemed like a few days. All of a sudden, a tremendous impact erupted from where Luo Fan was and swept in all directions. The endless lightning that appeared out of nowhere in the surroundings, which could distort space-time, distort laws, and repel the Tao, was completely shattered in an instant. In the blink of an eye, it was completely cleared. At this moment, the place where Luo Fan was had become clear. At this moment, Luo Fan's body had undergone an earth-shattering change. His body that was originally in the form of an octopus had turned into a form that he was more familiar with. Or rather, it could be said that it was already in the form of a natural Taoism aptitude that completely belonged to him. In other words, it was in the form of a human. Meanwhile, the light of heaven and earth behind his head had completely turned into the form of vortex. Its form was also quite different from when it had minced and devoured the bit of will of heaven and earth. Although it was also a vortex, the vortex from before was extremely violent. It seemed to be constantly releasing terrifying power that was enough to obliterate and destroy everything. But now, the vortex was completely different. This vortex was more stable and more mysterious. It did not look like a ball of light, but more like an eye. It was an extremely mysterious eye that seemed to have grown directly from the depths of space-time and above the Tao. The vortex that looked like an eye was quite similar to the vortex that had formed in the void above. The only difference was that the vortex above was larger and more illusory. At this moment, mysterious waves of fluctuations spread out from the vortex behind Luo Fan. These fluctuations seeped into the surrounding space-time, the surrounding laws, and even the Tao in the dark. These fluctuations did not let go of the slightest bit and seeped into it bit by bit. The area that the fluctuations had seeped into was independent, and it formed a clear separation from the wider world outside. In this separation, nothing in the outside world could affect everything in this area. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan was able to transform himself into this form at this moment and restore the body structure that he was most familiar with. If not for these fluctuations isolating the inside from the outside, he would either be unable to control such great power because this form was not recognized by the world and would directly collapse and be destroyed. Otherwise, he would be rejected by the world's will and the Tao because he did not have the appearance of a born Taoism body that controlled such great power. In the end, endless tribulations would descend to wipe him out. The reason for this was actually quite simple. After all, the light of heaven and earth that his fragment carried had already devoured a bit of the world's will. This was equivalent to the light of heaven and earth, from a certain point of view, becoming a part of the world's will. Since it was the world's will, even if it was only a part, it was enough to isolate the pressure of the entire world's will. It was enough to allow the entire world's will to ignore some abnormalities that appeared in the area enveloped by this small part of the world's will. At this moment, the huge eye-like vortex in the sky twisted slightly, and there seemed to be a vague feeling of loss coming from it. Evidently, because it was not complete, the world was unable to clearly determine the essence of the light of heaven and earth after it encountered the light of heaven and earth that had devoured a small part of it. It did not know whether it should deal with this bit of light of heaven and earth, and whether it should deal with Luo Fan, who was enveloped by the light of heaven and earth. Looks like I've succeeded. Sensing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly. He had originally thought that the light of heaven and earth could devour a part of the world's will that had reincarnated, and that it could become a focal point for his plan. However, he did not think that this focal point would be so useful. It could actually completely blind the senses of the world's will, as well as the world's will's hostility towards him. Compared to what he had expected, This was many times better. With a thought, he took a step forward and charged upwards in a flash. In the blink of an eye, he arrived before the huge vortex. At this moment, almost all living beings in the world could not help but look at the vortex from all directions. When they saw Luo Fan, the countless living beings were dumbfounded. What kind of creature is this? Why is it so ugly? The shock and bewilderment appeared in the hearts of most living beings at this moment, causing them to be dumbfounded and lament. To the living beings who regarded the octopus as the standard of beauty, Luo Fan, who did not even have tentacles and had such strange facial features, was clearly not good-looking. To them, the current Luo Fan was nothing more than a monster. The vortex began to stir violently at this moment. A great repulsive force appeared above the vortex, and it rushed towards Luo Fan fiercely. If it was not for the light of heaven and earth, which was like the world's will, protecting Luo Fan, what rushed over might not have been a repulsive force, but an endless attack. Evidently, the world's will felt that something was wrong and was unwilling to let Luo Fan approach it. Chapter 24-28. The moment the passageway was formed, the entire world seemed to have been struck by a terrifying force, causing an extremely strange tremor. Waves of boundless energy gathered towards the passageway from all directions, trying to drown the passageway and mend it once again. Unfortunately, although the boundless power shook the passageway and caused it to sway continuously, as if it was about to completely collapse in the next moment, the passageway eventually stabilized. In the end, it still carried Luo Fan and stepped into the residence of the world's will. With the small vortex behind him protecting him, Luo Fan seemed to be in a precarious situation, but he was actually extremely stable. In just a few short breaths, he passed through the passageway and arrived at the mysterious place, a place that was almost filled with a huge vortex. When he arrived here, the passageway behind him naturally no longer needed to be maintained. He immediately released the power that was maintaining the passageway, causing it to completely collapse in the blink of an eye and disappear without a trace. Although the world's will was already broken, it was still the world's will. As the world's will, its level of thinking was naturally not something that ordinary living beings could understand. Therefore, even if Luo Fan wanted to communicate with the world's will, he could not find a way at all. Under such circumstances, there was naturally no way for them to talk. Luo Fan looked at the huge vortex in front of him. With a slight thought, the light of heaven and earth behind his head charged forward and crashed into the vortex. It began to spin and stir wildly as it tore at the vortex with all its might. The huge vortex reacted extremely violently to the invasion of the light of heaven and earth. The center of the vortex seemed to have shifted to its original edge, which was where the light of the heavens and earth had invaded at this moment. The vortex frantically strangled the light of the heavens and earth, wanting to destroy the light of the heavens and earth and retrieve the will of the heavens and earth contained within it. Regardless of what the world will had planned for this world, it was no longer important at this juncture of life and death. Now, the most important thing for the world's will was to retrieve the portion of the world's will that it had split off and gather all its power to wipe out the living beings that dared to offend it. Apart from that, everything else was secondary. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan didn't care at all. He directly sat cross-legged outside the vortex. His eyes seemed to be open and closed, and his mind seemed to have entered a state that couldn't be described with words. It was as if he had transformed into an incomparably huge and terrifying thing, and was clashing and fighting with an even bigger and more terrifying existence. In a trance, there seemed to be endless information and principles constantly surging into his mind, infiltrating his memories, affecting his will, and distorting his thoughts. Fortunately, his view of the world was extremely firm, and it was like a final barrier that isolated all influences that could cause irreversible changes to his mind. That was why he was able to maintain his sense of self during this process and not be overturned by the various changes that occurred. As the conflict occurred in the residence of the will of the heavens and earth, there was also a drastic change outside the residence. A faintly discernible vortex appeared in the sky. This vortex was like a huge eye staring at everything under the sky. No matter what kind of living being it was, whether they were strong or weak, they all felt as if they were being stared at by this eye at this moment. A kind of fear and awe involuntarily arose in them. As time passed, the vortex gradually began to change. It was as if a huge and unparalleled force was pulling at this vortex, causing the center of the vortex to produce a strange deviation, gradually turning from the center to the edge. The color of the vortex also gradually began to change subtly from the center after the deviation. It was a change that could clearly be seen, but it was impossible to describe exactly what the difference was. After all, whether it was the vortex's original color or the color after the change, it was completely indescribable with words. This change gave all living beings an indescribable, ominous premonition. It was as if this was a great disaster for them. For a moment, it was unknown how many living beings directly knelt and prayed. Moreover, unlike in the past, the more brilliant and knowledgeable living beings were now, the more pious they were. Instead, those who were less knowledgeable were a little perfunctory. The reason for this was naturally because the more brilliant and knowledgeable living beings were, the more they understood the danger of this change, and the more they understood how dangerous it was for the entire world and all living beings if this change could not be stopped. As this change occurred, the karmic luck of all living beings began to undergo all sorts of subtle changes. If Luo Fan was observing the entire world from the perspective of karmic luck, he would discover that endless karmic luck was beginning to gather towards the residence of the will of the heavens and earth. It was as if the residence of the will of the heavens and earth had an unimaginable attraction to karmic luck. This world paid attention to karmic luck to begin with. It could even be said that karmic luck was more important to this world than to other worlds. Under such circumstances, the originally ethereal karmic luck in this world was naturally much more useful than other worlds. As a result, the karmic luck gathered was like a shot of adrenaline for the will of the heavens and earth. As it trembled, it began to spin faster and faster, and its strangling power towards the light of the heavens and earth continuously increased. As this change occurred, a pained expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. Strands of light began to seep out of his body, forming a net of light around him, doing its best to block some invisible pressure from the outside. These lights were extremely mysterious, and each one was a concept ability. Different lights represented different concepts and divine abilities. Now that the countless lights had formed a net, it was equivalent to countless concept abilities combining into a whole. This whole was extremely mysterious and vaguely had the taste of a worldview. It seemed to have an astonishing blocking effect on everything in the outside world, be it tangible or intangible. After the silk net was formed, even if the silk net didn't seem to be under any pressure or even deformed, Luo Fan's complexion still became a lot better, as if some kind of pressure that targeted him had been intercepted by him. At this moment, the light of the heavens and earth trembled slightly, and an extremely astonishing light was suddenly released. These rays of light were in the form of threads, constantly spreading in all directions. During this process, countless threads of light intertwined with each other, gradually forming a larger and larger net, occupying a wider and wider area in this huge vortex. Success. At this moment, the light in Luo Fan's eyes narrowed slightly, and the state of opening and closing completely disappeared. An inexplicable smile appeared on his face. Just now, his mind had already fused with the light of the heavens and earth that completely belonged to him, and the purpose was to guide the light of the heavens and earth to devour the will of the heavens and earth. It wasn't difficult for the light of the heavens and earth to devour the will of the heavens and earth. However, that wasn't because the light of the heavens and earth could devour the will of the heavens and earth at will. It was just because the amount of the will of the heavens and earth was too little. Because it was too little, The will of the heavens and earth was extremely weak compared to the light of the heavens and earth, and its resistance against the light of the heavens and earth was also extremely weak. That was why the entire devouring process was so smooth. It was obviously wrong to estimate the difficulty of the light of the heavens and earth devouring the will of the heavens and earth based on this difficulty. After all, although the will of the heavens and earth was incomplete due to the lack of the will of the heavens and earth, it had lost the various powers and incredible abilities that a complete will of the heavens and earth should have. But in terms of quantity, it was still countless times more than the will of the heavens and earth. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan closed his eyes and fused his mind with the light of the heavens and earth after he sent the light of the heavens and earth into the will of the heavens and earth. He guided the light of the heavens and earth and integrated various devouring techniques into it, so that the light of the heavens and earth could devour the will of the heavens and earth in a more skillful manner. The facts proved that his considerations were correct. Although the light of the heavens and earth was of a much higher level than Luo Fan's, it was still at the level of the will of the heavens and earth. However, it had only taken form not long ago, and there was still a huge gap between it and the true will of the heavens and earth. In terms of the will of the heavens and earth's ability to think, it was far inferior to Luo Fan's. In this way, without Luo Fan's guidance, the light of the heavens and earth could only rely on its own instincts to resist the will of the heavens and earth. In a situation where the enemy was strong and they were weak, such a choice could only be considered as courting death. However, with Luo Fan's participation and guidance, the situation was clearly completely different. Under his guidance, he directly used the light of the heavens and earth's ability to devour the great Tao in the previous world. The light of the heavens and earth split into countless threads, forming a net that devoured the will of the heavens and earth. Fortunately, the light of the heavens and earth had already devoured a bit of the will of the heavens and earth before, so it could now confuse the will of the heavens and earth senses towards him. This gave the light of the heavens and earth time to form a net. If it weren't for this convenience, the will of the heavens and earth would definitely treat these threads as foreign objects, and they would be completely destroyed by the will of the heavens and earth before they could form a net. As the net was formed, Luo Fan already clearly understood that the light of the heavens and earth's devouring of the will of the heavens and earth was already on the right track. The will of the heavens and earth no longer had any ability to resist. At this moment, he discovered that waves of providence were appearing out of nowhere from all directions, like rivers flowing into the sea. They were continuously pouring into the vortex in front of him. With a slight jolt in his heart, he already understood what was going on and could not help but sigh softly. It's a pity that we can't coexist. The heavens and earth were specially constructed by the Great Tribulation to restrict him and assimilate him. If he wanted to survive this Great Tribulation, he would have to transcend this world. And to do so, he would obviously have to fight against the will of the heavens and earth. In this way, although he did not have any enmity towards the living beings in this world, he had no choice but to go against their will. He even had no choice but to kill them with a wave of his hand. An even larger vortex appeared out of thin air around the huge vortex. It was like a cover that completely enveloped the huge vortex, which was also the will of the heavens and earth. After the huge vortex appeared, it directly received the providence that was continuously pouring into the will of the heavens and earth, directly cutting off the providence that the will of the heavens and earth had obtained. This caused the will of the heavens and earth to lose its source of replenishment, and it could only rely on its own accumulation to resist the corrosion and devouring of the light of the heavens and earth. Following this change, all the living beings in the void in the outside world looked up and saw a figure suddenly appear around the vortex. It was the figure of the monster that everyone had seen before, the figure that had soared into the sky. However, compared to before, this figure seemed so sacred and majestic at this time. Although it still did not conform to their aesthetic standards, They actually felt an indescribable harmony and perfection from it. In fact, some living beings even faintly felt that the appearance of this creature was more harmonious and perfect than their own appearance. What is this? This doubt appeared in the hearts of almost all the living beings at this moment, making them all feel bewildered. When the figure of the monster appeared, the vortex that they felt would have a huge impact on the changes gradually began to glow. This light was not very strong at first, and it could only be considered as a faint radiance. However, as time passed, as the figure became more and more real, the light became stronger and stronger. In the end, it looked like a sun that was countless times larger than a normal sun had appeared in the sky. An extremely sacred, majestic, and powerful aura spread out from the glowing vortex of this moment. Being enveloped by this extremely dazzling light that should have been enough to blind them, all the living beings felt an indescribable warmth surge into their hearts. It was as if they had returned to their mother's embrace at this moment, and they felt that incomparably vast warmth. This should have been an extremely comfortable and satisfying feeling. However, at this moment, all the living beings with sharp senses felt an indescribable sense of unease. Chapter 24-29. This uneasiness caused their expressions to distort. It was a distortion formed by the conflict between their emotions on the surface and their instincts in the depths of their hearts. It was a distortion that bordered on irritation. The world's will was the world's will. For all living beings in this world, if there was a problem with the world's will, it meant that there was a problem with the foundation of their existence. Under such circumstances, all living beings were naturally attracted to it, and the focus of their lives had unknowingly shifted to the world's will. Eating and drinking, which were necessary for survival, were suppressed. Fortunately, this world was a world in the sea. What filled the world wasn't the void, but the liquid that was similar to seawater. Therefore, although the necessities of survival, such as eating and drinking, were suppressed, they could still absorb a certain amount of nutrients from the boundless liquid that permeated between heaven and earth. This was not enough to completely satisfy them, but at least it could sustain their survival for a relatively long time. It was precisely because of this that all living beings in this world kept looking up at the sky. They were either devout or irritated as they looked at the incomparably sacred and dignified light in the sky, as well as the changing vortex. Luo Fan naturally didn't care about all of this. He only guided the world's light to continuously spread out the net and penetrate into various parts of the world's will. He began to work hard to devour the world's will, working hard to turn it into a part of him. Due to various conveniences, the process was rather smooth. In particular, after he cut off the endless karmic luck transmitted by all living beings, preventing the world's will from being replenished, the devouring process became even smoother. 100 years passed in the blink of an eye. During these 100 years, the world's will's residence developed according to the direction it had been set back then. The threads emitted from the world's light had already formed a net that completely filled the vortex, which was also the world's will. Outside the world's will's residence, in this world that was filled with the boundless liquid, all living beings behaved the same as 100 years ago. They still looked up at the sky, either devout, irritated, or uneasy. However, compared to 100 years ago, the number of living beings in this world had decreased by more than half. The reason for the decrease in the number of living beings was not because of anything else, but because of hunger. Although the boundless liquid contained some of the nutrients that living beings needed to survive. However, in the end, it was just a little. Perhaps it could sustain the survival of these creatures for a month or two, or even a year or two. That was only a year or two at most. Compared to the time scale of 100 years, it was still too short. Thus, during these 100 years, most of the creatures that could not absorb enough nutrients gradually died as they looked up to the sky. As for the remaining half of the creatures that could still survive, they were either powerful enough to survive by absorbing energy from the outside world, or they were in a special location where the nutrients in the seawater were much more abundant than in other places and could even satisfy their basic needs. Because of this change, the entire world was filled with a strange feeling. At a glance, those originally pious expressions appeared indescribably terrifying. However, not a single living being paid any attention to this. None of the living beings stopped to look up to their companions because they had starved to death, and they continued with their lives. It was as if the most important thing to them now was to look up to them. Compared to this, everything else was secondary, including their own lives. Even these living beings did not care about this, so naturally, Luo Fan would not care about it either. Seeing that the world's light had already filled up the world's will with countless threads, he let out a soft cry. This cry did not seem very special in the residents of the world's will, but in this world, this cry was so grand and vast that it was indescribable. It felt as if the sky had suddenly rumbled with billions of thunder, causing the entire world to violently tremble. The endless sound poured into the ears of countless living beings and resounded in their hearts. Oh no, the world is going to be destroyed. Countless living beings suddenly woke up at this moment and cried out. This comprehension came from the thunder, as well as their instincts. Only after this comprehension did these living beings pay attention to their surroundings. They noticed the strange changes in this world. At that moment, all sorts of wails, cries, screams, and even maniacal laughter appeared out of nowhere in this world. The endless flow of providence that was originally pouring into the residents of the worlds was forcefully cut off by Luo Fan. Instead, it returned to the world through the characteristics of the residents of the world's will, turning into the endless sacred and dignified light. At this moment, the boundless providence that was being reflected back was completely cut off. As this happened, the light in the sky gradually disappeared. However, Luo Fan's figure did not disappear because of this, and the vortex formed by the worlds did not disappear either. It was just that it lacked that sacredness. Clearly, without the return of the endless providence, the light that made all living beings feel sacred and pious had lost its source and could no longer be produced. As Luo Fan cried out, the net that had completely enveloped the world's will and the residents of the worlds began to shrink rapidly. As it shrank, the light in the world gradually swelled, and its color became more and more real and condensed. The light it emitted vaguely showed signs of changing in the direction of the world's will. A long river appeared in the world at this moment. This river was so huge and so long. Just this river alone felt like it had filled the entire world. The Great Path has appeared. At this moment, Luo Fan finally pulled his attention away from the residents of the world's will and looked towards the world. At this moment, the long river that had appeared in the world and almost completely filled the world was none other than the Great Path of the world. The Great Path appeared in the world at this moment and directly enveloped all living beings in the world. It even directly controlled all the laws, time, space, matter, and energy in the world. In the blink of an eye, the Great Path seemed to have become the center of the world. Everything in the world began to spin around it, forming a strange tornado. Of course, only Luo Fan could see this tornado. To the living beings in this world, all they could see was the world beginning to change. The various lights and shadows they were familiar with were directly replaced by some kind of extremely illusory light and shadow that they could not describe. They did not even know that the Great Path was manifested in the form of a long river. It's indeed different from the world in the previous world. The Great Path in the previous world didn't take such initiative. Luo Fan could not help but sigh inwardly when he saw this. In the previous world, no matter what happened to the world's will, whether it was devoured or scattered, whether it was independent or controlled, the Great Path was as stable as a mountain. It did not move at all, as if the worlds had nothing to do with it. Only when Luo Fan began to directly attack the Great Path did the Great Path react. However, the world in this world was completely different. The Great Path in this world had already taken action before he had completely devoured the world's will. It had taken the initiative to show itself. This difference in initiative made Luo Fan realize something in his heart. He vaguely seemed to understand some of the Great Path's characteristics. However, This understanding did not matter to him for the time being. At this moment, the Great Path taking the initiative to show itself brought him some new trouble. At the very least, this meant that he could no longer smoothly devour the world's will. He could not be like before, where he could obtain a certain amount of time after devouring the world's will to deal with the Great Path. As expected, just as he was thinking about this, the residents of the world's will suddenly collapsed. Luo Fan and the world's will that was being devoured by the light of heaven and earth completely broke away from the residents and appeared directly in the world above the Great Path. It quickly rushed down towards the Great Path below and was about to be devoured by the Great Path. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan did not dare to hesitate at all. He rushed straight towards the world's will. Or, to be more specific, he rushed towards the light of heaven and earth that was currently devouring the world's will. Given the Great Path's current state, if the light of heaven and earth entered it, it could still resist the Great Path's corrosion to a certain extent. However, if his body rushed into it, it would be a disaster. Not only would he be corroded by the Great Path if he rushed into it with his body, but he would also be assimilated, strangled, and devoured by the endless mysteries of the Great Path. His current body was in human form, and there was a qualitative difference between him and the natural Taoist aptitude in this world. He was completely incompatible with the Great Tao. If he entered it, just the rejection of the Great Tao would probably be enough to cause him shocking harm. Because of this, the only choice Luo Fan had at this time was, of course, to enter the light of heaven and earth. He used the nature of the light of heaven and earth, which was barely at the same level as the world's will, to protect himself so that he would not be directly harmed by the Great Path. Although it was his light of heaven and earth, it was still devouring the world's will. When Luo Fan entered it, he still encountered a lot of resistance. It took him a lot of effort to break through this obstacle and enter the light of heaven and earth. He sat down in the center of the vortex formed by the light of heaven and earth. Fortunately, his ability to control the light of heaven and earth was strong enough. Otherwise, even if he could enter the light of heaven and earth, he would not be able to return to his position before the light of heaven and earth entered the Great Path. Sizzle, 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 sizzle. At this time, terrifying corrosive sounds could be heard from the point where the world's will and the Great Path came into contact. Amidst the corrosive sounds, wisps of smoke were emitted from the point where the two came into contact. They were like bubbles that floated upwards. At this moment, the painful emotions were transmitted through the worlds will into the light of heaven and earth. Then, through the light of heaven and earth, it drowned Luo Fan. If Luo Fan was not the master of the light of heaven and earth, and was protected by the light of heaven and earth, the pain alone would have been enough to make him lose his mind for a long time. However, even so, Luo Fan could not help but tremble at this time. His eyes were slightly dazed. This kind of pain was simply too terrifying. In the face of this pain, Luo Fan even felt as if he had become an ordinary person who had been thrown into a blender and stirred crazily. Is the Great Path going to destroy the worlds while at the same time? After a while, when Luo Fan had gotten used to this pain, such a thought flashed through his mind. This pain was the pain of the world's will. It was the endless pain caused by the Great Path destroying the world's will. This situation was clearly beyond his imagination. After all, the world's will was like the world's will, and the Great Path was the source of everything in this world. In other words, the world's will could also be considered the Great Path's will. Under such circumstances, all of the Great Tao's actions and decisions could only be confirmed by the will of the world. In this way, it was obvious that it was almost impossible for the Great Tao to make the decision to destroy the will of the world. It was like if a person wanted to commit suicide, they would definitely not make a decision that would turn them into a living dead forever to cure their illness. But now, the Great Path had made such an inconceivable decision. In Luo Fan's opinion, the world was simply like the hair on an animal's body to the Great Path. It seemed as if its existence or not didn't affect it at all. How was it possible for him to react in time? Without waiting for Luo Fan to react, the great Tao's corrosion and damage to the will of the heavens and earth did not stop for even a moment. At this moment, it was as if it was facing an enemy that posed the greatest threat to it. It almost crazily damaged the will of the heavens and earth, causing the sizzling sounds to become even more concentrated. The smoke that was being emitted from the will of the heavens and earth became even more numerous. Perhaps this is the fundamental reason why this world divided a part of its will to delay the arrival of the great calamity. In the end, such a conclusion appeared in Luo Fan's heart, causing an inexplicable bitter smile to appear on his face. Chapter 2430. Luo Fan naturally could not sit by and watch as the world was constantly being whittled away by the world will. Originally, he planned to first devour the world will, then spend some time to take control of this region of the world, and then modify it to affect the world will. In the end, the world will would open its doors to him. At that point, he would devour the world will, and then the entire world. However, the world will had already taken the initiative to take action. Clearly, there is no more time for him to adjust and modify it step by step. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan clearly only had one choice, which was to immediately start the process that would have taken some time to start, and directly devour the world will. After he made up his mind, he no longer hesitated. With a thought, the net of threads that had been converging towards the light of heaven and earth suddenly reversed its direction. It suddenly turned inward and extended outwards, directly towards the great Tao outside of the will of heaven and earth. The strange sound paused for a moment, and changed from being used on the world to being used on the net of threads that was constantly spreading outwards. However, in contrast, the endless smoke that was emitted from the surface of the contact between the world will and the world will started to decrease. Although it was still being produced endlessly, the scale was clearly much smaller. Evidently, the world will was being whittled away by the world will by a lot. In order to achieve this goal, Luo Fan paid a huge price. At this moment, his light of the universe was replacing the world will to withstand the corrosion of the world will and withstanding the whittling away. The corrosion and whittling away brought about pain that was several times greater than before. It made Luo Fan feel that his soul had been completely drowned by the endless pain. If it was not for the layer of light of the universe, he might have completely lost his mind at this moment. As expected, without the control of the world will, the light of the universe won't be acknowledged by the world will in the end. Sensing the pain from the light of the universe, Luo Fan could not help but think. However, it was clear that even so, he had no intention of giving up at all. Instead, he tried his best to guide the light of heaven and earth to assimilate the part of the great Tao that was enveloped by the web of threads. He was preparing to devour that part of the great Tao. This kind of effort was not enough to directly eliminate the pain transmitted by the light of heaven and earth, but it was enough to weaken the degree of corrosion and assimilation of the silk webs. Although the sizzling sound continued, the range of the sound began to shrink, at least compared to the ratio of the net. It was constantly reducing. This was because the surrounding great Taos within the range of the silk net were gradually assimilated, and the conflict with the silk net was constantly decreasing. Now, it was the surrounding great Taos that were constantly eroding the silk net. An indescribable pressure appeared in the hearts of all living beings. At this moment, all living beings in this world felt an indescribable anger and hostility welling up from the depths of their hearts. In a trance, they all turned their gazes to the strange network in the sky, which had layers of colors on its own. All of them clearly understood that their greatest mission in life was to destroy this network, kill the monster that existed in the center of the network. If they couldn't complete this mission, then what awaited them would be eternal damnation. In an instant, countless living beings soared into the sky and charged toward the network. When these living beings made up their minds to respond to the call of their hearts, they realized that they seemed to have received some kind of incredible blessing, and their cultivation realm began to rise at an unimaginable speed. Originally, There was not even a false saint in this world, but now, under that strange blessing, almost all living beings' realms had broken through. False saints appeared one after another. Waves of unparalleled aura were continuously released from those living beings and swept across the entire world. Under normal circumstances, the commotion caused by any false saint or even a false saint's breakthrough would be enough to cause the entire world to tremble and make all living beings marvel for hundreds or even thousands of years. However, now that so many false saints had appeared at the same time, their aura was enough to change the entire aura of this world. It was enough to cause the essence of this world to undergo a subtle shift, but no living being paid attention to them. No living being would be as shocked as they were under normal circumstances in the past. All living beings, be it the false saints themselves or other living beings, had their eyes focused on the center of the network in the sky. They looked at the figure that made their hearts throb and made them feel enmity. In their opinion, only that figure was worth paying attention to. Everything else besides that figure was secondary and not worth mentioning at all. The higher they went, the closer they got to the net of threads, and the clearer they could feel each other. It was as if there was some kind of strange power connecting them together, allowing them to communicate with each other and transfer power to each other. With such a change, the attacking posture of these living beings naturally changed. All kinds of attacks that they had launched without any scruples or were preparing to launch all changed at this moment. They began to cooperate with other living beings and began to work hard to adapt to the attacks of other living beings, strengthening the overall attack as much as possible. With such a small adjustment, the pressure they felt on Luo Fan above them skyrocketed. From a state that was originally not enough for Luo Fan to glance at, it became a state that made him involuntarily turn his gaze over. As Luo Fan turned his gaze over, the endless living beings all felt an indescribable fear emerge from the bottom of their hearts, causing their gazes to become extremely solemn at this moment. Danger! This warning appeared in the hearts of countless living beings at the same time. In this instant, they felt a huge pressure suddenly surging towards them from all directions. Under this kind of pressure, their bodies suddenly froze, and their own power began to quickly dissipate. Boom, 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 boom. At this moment, loud explosions suddenly rang out from within the bodies of those living beings. Amidst these explosions, those living beings instantly seemed to have broken free from all shackles and charged towards Luo Fan at an even faster speed. However, in contrast, the eyes of these living beings that originally had some clarity were now completely filled with emptiness and mania. Clearly, they had completely lost their clarity. Are they completely controlled? Looking at these living beings, Luo Fan could not help but frown. He was now becoming more and more curious about the great Tao of this world. It was only natural that the great Tao could affect living beings. Not to mention affecting living beings, it wouldn't be strange even if he could completely control living beings. The reason why Luo Fan felt that the great Tao in front of him was extremely strange was that this great Tao's method of controlling the living beings in this world did not seem like a normal great Tao. Instead, it seemed like a strange what was controlling everything from behind. Could it be that there's some kind of existence controlling this world? This thought surfaced in Luo Fan's mind at this moment. With this thought, his expression could not help but become more and more solemn. When this fragment of his entered this world had just been constructed, and there were not many living beings in the entire world. It could be said that from the birth of this world until now, he had seen everything that had happened. Under such circumstances, if there was still some kind of existence that could surpass his control and carry out a large-scale operation on this world, or even control the entire world, how could he endure this? Various thoughts flashed through his mind, and the various major processes that this world had experienced from the beginning until now went through his mind. Indeed, it's extremely likely that there's some kind of living beings will controlling this world from behind. With this thought in mind, his eyes narrowed, and a sharp light shot out from them. If there really was some kind of living beings will controlling everything in this world, including the world's will, then all the previous doubts could clearly be explained. If the world's will was autonomous, it was hard for him to imagine that it would split itself into the world to delay the arrival of the world's great tribulation. It was even harder to imagine that the world's great Tao would take the initiative to erase the world's will at this moment, in order to erase all possible dangers that could threaten this world. As for the many living beings in this world now, the very strange changes that seem to be controlled by a living being behind the scenes could not be explained. Who is it? With this thought in mind, the light of heaven and earth trembled slightly. Waves of his concept God's power began to swarm in all directions along the Silk Network, and fiercely penetrated the outside Great Tao, causing the Great Tao that was affected by this concept God's power to inexplicably become chaotic at this moment. A turbid color began to appear in those chaotic areas. Even in normal space-time and the normal laws were disturbed at this moment. The direction that those living beings were pouncing towards was clearly the focus of Luo Fan's attention. At this moment, most of the concept God's power was pouncing towards those living beings. For the Great Tao itself, these concept God's power might only have the effect of disturbing it. At most, it would make the color of the Great Tao become turbid. However, for the living beings in this world, the effect of these concept God's power was obviously not that small. At this moment, the instant they encountered the concept God's power, they did not even have the ability to resist and were directly erased by the concept God's power. They didn't even have the ability to scream. The concept God's power was extremely mysterious. After erasing those living beings, it did not immediately calm down. Instead, it traced back to the source and used the various subtle connections of those living beings to spread towards the existence behind those living beings that was making those living beings pounce towards Luo Fan. Under this guidance, most of the concept God's power directly collided with the surrounding Great Tao. They produced a strange reaction with the Great Tao and caused some sort of chaos before disappearing without a trace. However, there's also a small portion of the concept God's power that directly seeped into the Great Tao and spread towards a certain direction. It seemed to be guided by a certain source and kept condensing towards that source. Seeing this, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. Looks like I found it. His gaze traced the direction of the concept God's power. If it was just one living being, this tracing would naturally be meaningless. After all, the probability of a small number of concept God's power spreading was too high. Who could be sure that the direction of the concept God's power spreading wasn't due to all sorts of accidents or coincidences? However, there were simply too many living beings now. It could be counted in the trillions. With so many living beings, even if only 1/10,000th of them had concept God's power that could trace back to the target, the number would still be counted in the trillions. With so many concept God's power seeping towards a certain location from all directions, there was no need to wait for the concept God's power to travel too far. As long as one could see the direction of the concept God's power, one would be able to determine where the existence that was guiding the concept God's power was after a slight combination. At this moment, Luo Fan had already focused his gaze towards a certain location in the distance through the guidance of the countless concept God's power. It was a place that was extremely deep in the Great Tao, and it felt like it had even reached the end of the Great Tao. That place seemed very normal at first glance, just like an ordinary Grand Tao. It contained boundless profundities of the Grand Tao, boundless profundities of laws, and countless principles of the combination of matter, energy, time, and space. However, upon closer inspection, one would realize that the combination of the various mysteries seemed a little strange. Vaguely, there seemed to be some characteristic of turning nothingness into reality. Within the countless mysteries and principles, there was a hidden existence that truly existed, an existence that was incompatible with the Great Tao. It's there. Seeing this, how could Luo Fan not know that he had found the target he was looking for? If Luo Fan relied solely on himself, it would naturally be extremely difficult to cross the entire Great Tao and rush to that strange location. It might even be close to impossible. However, Luo Fan wasn't alone now. Chapter 2431. Luo Fan's heart was slightly moved. His body was directly wrapped in the light of the heavens and the earth, and he quickly rushed toward the end of the road. As he charged, the surrounding great Tao naturally reacted violently. Endless obstructions appeared from all directions and engulfed the light of the world. They frantically stirred and eroded the light of the world, doing their best to corrode and assimilate the light of the world. However, it was a pity that the light of the world was still surrounded by countless tiny nets. As the light of the world moved, the nets moved as well. As the nets moved, they naturally moved along with a portion of the great Tao that was enveloped by the nets. Although these great Tao had already been assimilated by the light of the world, they were still great Tao. In essence, they were still similar to the boundless great Tao. However, the great Tao didn't have much of a conflict with the surrounding great Tao. As a result, the paths became a buffer between the light of the universe and the paths. As a result, the resistance the light of the universe faced when it moved was many times less than normal. In this way, the speed at which the light of heaven and earth was moving was much faster than when it was moving in the great Tao. Due to all these factors, it only took a few days for the light of the world to traverse the endless distance and arrive at the place that was created by countless mysteries. When the light of the world arrived and the net made contact with that place, a huge rumble suddenly erupted from that strange place. Terrifying shock waves constantly spread out, one after another. The surrounding great Tao seemed to have turned into a raging sea, unable to maintain its original calmness. A turbid luster constantly appeared in the place where the shock waves spread out, turning the clear great Tao into a yellow river. Compared to the other regions that had a strong conflict with the light of the world, but ultimately couldn't stop the assimilation of the light of the world, this strange place's resistance to the light of the world was extraordinarily strong. Under this kind of resistance, the silk nets seemed to have collided with an unbreakable and sturdy barrier. Every single one of them bounced back the moment they collided. In the blink of an eye, the entire silk net began to spread in all directions from that spot. It's indeed extraordinary. Seeing this, Luo Fan revealed a look of admiration and curiosity. This strange place was rooted in the great Tao, but it surpassed it. It felt as if it was a plant that had grown out of the ground and was completely different from a soil. Although he couldn't directly invade this strange place, it didn't mean that Luo Fan couldn't do anything about it. At this moment, his heart moved slightly. The countless threads from the light of the world went around the strange place and began to wrap around the strange place. They began to try their best to assimilate all the great Taos around the strange place. Even though the strange place influence had caused the surrounding great Tao to undergo subtle changes and made it more resistant to the great Tao than usual, it was still, in the end, it was still the great Tao, and it was still fundamentally different from the strange place. As a result, the great Tao would still be assimilated bit by bit and corroded bit by bit until it was completely controlled by the light of the world. As the corrosion was complete, the great Tao's connection with the surrounding great Tao was directly cut off. It was about to be isolated and helpless at this moment. A tentacle suddenly reached out from the strange place. The tentacle seemed to be real, yet incorporeal. It seemed to be extremely large, yet extremely small. It seemed to be extremely fast, yet extremely slow. After it reached out, with a slight tremble, it had already thrown the endless threads around it into chaos. The surrounding silk net that was about to completely cut off the connection between this strange place and the surrounding great Tao was instantly broken, allowing it to re-establish its connection with the other great Tao in the surroundings. Seeing this, Luo Fan was shocked. It was obvious that the existence hidden in that strange place had finally made its move. Once it made a move, it revealed a part of its strength. There was no need to mention how powerful this existence was. If it wasn't this powerful, how could it have disturbed the net formed by the light of the world? How could it re-establish the connection between this strange existence and the surrounding great Tao? However, it wasn't as powerful as the worst-case scenario that Luo Fan had expected. Originally, Luo Fan had thought that the existence might be at the level of a true saint. However, although the power displayed by the existence in front of him was powerful, it hadn't reached the level of a true saint. At the very least, if it was a true saint-level technique, with Luo Fan's current foundation and eyesight, he wouldn't be able to see many traces of it. He wouldn't even be able to understand it. However, when the existence in front of him made a move, he could sense a little bit of the profoundness it displayed. Just this alone was obviously enough. With a thought, endless light shot out from Luo Fan's body and formed a three-legged round cauldron in the void. Then, it fiercely smashed towards the strange place. The light that formed the three-legged round cauldron was none other than the countless divine abilities of concepts that he had condensed from the world of laws. When they formed the three-legged round cauldron, they reconstructed and sublimated these divine abilities. Not only did they form a complete whole, but the power of each divine ability was also enhanced beyond imagination. This made their overall power more than 10 million times stronger than when they were stacked normally. When the three-legged round cauldron formed by countless light collided with the strange place, the originally messy web naturally gathered towards the three-legged round cauldron. It was as if countless threads of smoke had grown out of the three-legged round cauldron. They protected the three-legged round cauldron as it fiercely smashed towards the strange place. As it smashed down, the great Tao that had already been partially assimilated began to stir wildly, erupting with earth-shattering power. It was unknown how many phantoms of heaven and earth were born in this chaos in an instant. They released supreme power that could destroy heaven and earth as they fiercely blocked the three-legged round cauldron. Boom, 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 boom. The three-legged round cauldron was like a hot knife through butter. It completely crushed the countless phantoms of heaven and earth formed by the great Tao. It was as if it was crushing layers of eggshells. With such an irresistible force, the three-legged round cauldron quickly arrived above the strange place and fiercely suppressed it. Under Luo Fan's refinement, the three-legged round cauldron had already displayed its suppressive effect to the limit. It could almost be called the representative of suppression, the manifestation of suppression. At this moment, under the support of boundless concept divine abilities, the three-legged round cauldron that seemed to have materialized suppressed the strange place. Its momentum could be imagined. It was so much so that before the three-legged cauldron came into contact with the mysterious area, the suppressive aura had already caused the mysterious area to start to crumble. The countless mysteries that lingered on it had already started to crumble, causing the mysterious area to start to tremble. The endless great Tao outside began to churn at this moment. All the living beings in this world felt as if their privacy had been violated. They felt enraged and frantically charged towards this region. They were like iron shavings attracted by a magnet, forming an extremely mysterious pattern. At this moment, another tentacle stretched out from the strange place and faced the three-legged round cauldron in an extremely strange and contradictory manner. With regards to the appearance of the tentacles, Luo Fan had already expected it. At this moment, it was naturally impossible for him to let the tentacles easily destroy his attack like how he did with the light of the heavens and earth. At that moment, the three-legged cauldron trembled slightly and its power surged. Boundless profound fluctuations began to radiate from its body. Faintly, there seemed to be worlds appearing one after another. They overlapped and collided with the tentacle. Chi-chi-chi-chi-chi. Countless crisp sounds rang out the moment the shadows came into contact with the tentacle. Following that, the countless illusions of the world completely collapsed and disappeared from this contact. However, the collapse of these worlds was not without any effect. Although it had already collapsed, the tentacle had also encountered great obstruction during this process. The feeling of lifting something heavy as if it was light disappeared along with the collapse. Countless strange images began to appear from the tentacle. The tentacle seemed to have transformed into hundreds of millions of tentacles in an instant. A large number of shadows swayed as they closed in on the three-legged round cauldron and wrapped around it. This kind of attack seemed even more mysterious and grand, but in reality, it was many times weaker than the tentacle that had rushed out without any smoke or fire, stirring up chaos and wiping out everything. Luo Fan's expression didn't change in the slightest in the face of the countless tentacles rushing over. With a thought, the three-legged cauldron's power was released, and a large amount of suppressive power erupted with a loud rumble. Crack! 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 At this moment, a huge roar erupted from the countless tentacles, and the countless tentacles began to collapse rapidly. In the end, all the shadows turned into one and collided with the three-legged round cauldron. After that, the tentacles started to collapse swiftly, and the three-legged cauldron followed the collapse of the tentacle as it ferociously descended towards the mysterious location below. In the blink of an eye, it had already surpassed the length of the tentacle and smashed heavily onto the mysterious location. Boundless mysteries of the Grand Tao, space-time, and laws erupted from the strange place and shot madly in all directions. However, the strange place was unable to resist the suppression of the three-legged round cauldron at all. Under the suppression of the three-legged round cauldron, its structure began to collapse, and the existence within it was revealed. It was an existence that Luo Fan's fragment was extremely familiar with. It was an existence that looked extremely similar to the creature that had been reincarnated from the will of the world. In the eyes of the world, it was an extremely perfect creature that had the form of a natural Tao constitution. In other words, it was an extremely strange creature that looked like an octopus. In the eyes of the world's aesthetics, this octopus creature was obviously extremely perfect. Whether it was its tentacles, the bumps on its body, the distance between its eyes, the color of its eyes, or even the specks of mucus on its body, they were all so beautiful and perfect. From the perspective of cultivation, this creature's body structure was extremely compatible with the essence of the world. If it were to cultivate with such a body structure, then perhaps it would be faster and smoother than the creature that had been reincarnated from the will of the world. If there was any other creature in the world that could possess such a perfect body structure, then Luo Fan could only think of one. That was the creator of the world. As the creator of this world, no matter what kind of structure his body was, no matter how strange or mediocre his body form was, in the world he created, his image would definitely be the most compatible with the world and the most suitable for cultivation, the innate Taoist physique. All other creatures born in the world, no matter what their own thoughts were, as long as their form and body structure were different from this existence, then they would deviate from the way of the world and deviate from the requirements of the natural Tao constitution. Only such an existence could exude such a strong sense of perfection at this time. Only such an existence could make Luo Fan's image, which went against his sense of aesthetics, completely unable to find any flaws. How is this possible? If it's the creator of the world, how can it be so weak? When Luo Fan saw this scene, a feeling of disbelief flashed through his heart. The living being before him did indeed match the image of the creator of this world. However, there was a world of difference between the strength of this living being and the creator of this world. As the creator of the perfect world, normally speaking, it should be an incredible existence like the true saint. Only such an existence could truly stabilize a perfect world in a state of chaos. Only then could a perfect world truly obtain the potential to become a great world. Chapter 2432. At this moment, the octopus-like creature's body trembled, and the many tentacles on its body flashed, instantly tearing apart the wreckage that could still hold on. It was so straightforward that it was as if the surrounding structure was not something that could exist in the Great Tao. Instead, it was like a fragile structure made of plasticine that had yet to be fixed. After completely tearing it apart, the tentacles did not stop immediately. Instead, they went one step further and directly wrapped around the three-legged cauldron that Luo Fan had formed from the combination of many concept theurgy. although the three-legged cauldron had already completely destroyed the strange place. Leaving only some wreckage here, it was ultimately only a concept theurgy. Completing such a great undertaking was not easy for it. At the very least, it was not a great undertaking that could be completed without paying a price at this moment. Although the three-legged cauldron still maintained its structure and was still in that extremely mysterious and wonderful appearance, it was already many times weaker than before. Perhaps the three-legged cauldron could barely fight against these tentacles for a while. However, facing these tentacles now, the three-legged cauldron did not even resist. The tentacles had already cut into it, and with a slight tremble, it completely collapsed and was annihilated at this moment. Luo Fan felt an indescribable danger pouncing at him. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan had a grave expression on his face. Although he thought that the creature in front of him was weaker than he had imagined, that was only when compared to a true divine. As a matter of fact, this creature's strength was still extremely shocking. At the very least, compared to the current Luo Fan, it was much stronger. Facing such an existence, how could he not take it seriously? At this moment, his heart moved slightly. The light of the world around him began to surge, and the tentacles condensed from the light of the world rushed out of the vortex. They brazenly charged at the creature and fiercely stabbed at it. At this moment, the creature's many tentacles reacted at the same time. As they moved, countless mysterious lights flashed on the tentacles. Under the influence of the tentacle, the surrounding great Tao began to undergo various indescribable changes. In the blink of an eye, it had already turned into countless mysterious threads, faintly outlining a chaotic cloud that fiercely collided with the tentacle formed by the light of the universe. Under this collision, the chaotic clouds formed by the threads completely collapsed, and the tentacles formed by the light of the world also completely collapsed under this impact. However, the tentacle did not stop after that. Instead, it shook slightly and turned around again, charging toward the vortex like light of heaven and earth once more. As it charged, the entire great Tao began to surge, and the entire world trembled. All the rules and laws between the heavens and earth, all time and space, all matter and energy, seemed to come to life at this moment. From all over the world, they began to condense towards the location of the tentacle, forming an extremely terrifying pressure that crushed towards the light of the world at this moment. Crackling sounds came from the countless threads distributed above the light of the world, causing the threads to begin to deform in a strange manner. The entire silk net released countless mysterious lights as it changed shape. The light that could originally only appear at the edge of the silk net, the erosion of the light of the world, had already penetrated the surface barrier under this pressure. Like long needles, they ruthlessly stabbed into the depths of the silk net. In the face of this change, Luo Fan's eyes narrowed. He sent out a will, and the light of the world naturally responded. The extremely vast silk net began to tremble subtly. As it trembled, the great Tao that was wrapped in the silk net was also mobilized. Endless power was released from its body and began to collide with the endless power that was crushing towards it from the outside. In terms of strength alone, the power released by the great Tao that was wrapped in the silk net was naturally far inferior to the power that was crushing towards it from the outside. However, the essence of this power was so similar to the power that was crushing towards it from the outside. This similarity caused the power from the outside to involuntarily calm down the moment it came into contact with the power inside. Originally, 100 portions of the power could only exert a portion of the effect at most. However, even so, Luo Fan still felt that the light of the world had suffered an irresistible impact. The light of the world, along with the great Tao that was wrapped in the silk net, were instantly sent flying like a baseball. Their bodies flew straight back, leaving a long vacuum mark in the void. At this moment, the octopus-like life form had already rushed out of the strange wreckage. Its figure was as relaxed as an ordinary octopus in the sea. With a few waves of its tentacles, it had already left behind countless afterimages. From all directions, It rushed towards Luo Fan in a way that transcended time and space. At this moment, Luo Fan found that he had suffered attacks that spanned from the past, present, and future. This kind of attack was so dense that he could only face it head-on in order to have a chance to block it. At the same time, he also felt that the existences that corresponded to him in the other planes were also suffering similar attacks. However, compared to the irresistible attack that covered the past, present, and future of the reality plane, the attack that one's corresponding existence in other planes suffered was not so absolute. In the face of these attacks, the existences that corresponded to him in the other planes had their own reactions. After dodging or facing it head-on, the existences that corresponded to him in the other planes easily escaped and were not attacked by the octopus-like life form at this moment. Because the laws in the different planes were different, the results of the attacks would naturally appear at different times. Before the attacks in the real world had completely come to an end, the results of many planes in the other planes had already been completely determined. Therefore, when the tentacles reached the top of his head, Luo Fan was already completely relieved. With the existences that corresponded to him in the other planes, even if he completely failed in the real world and all traces of his existence were erased, he would still be unscathed since he no longer had any worries. He naturally felt more at ease. At this moment, he raised his hand and drew in the void. Boundless light appeared in his hand, forming countless sharp blades that shot towards the endless tentacles. Naturally, these sharp blades were not ordinary blades, and their attacks were not just ordinary cutting attacks. Each blade contained countless concept abilities, and the attack characteristics of each blade were also different due to the different concept abilities. In the end, these blades possessed various effects that ordinary creatures and cultivators could not even imagine. For a moment, the countless tentacles were either devoured by some strange space-time, wrapped by various runes, turned illusory, became extremely heavy, or changed into all sorts of strange forms. In the blink of an eye, the attacks of the countless tentacles had been completely disintegrated, however. This seemed to be nothing to the life form. At this moment, the life form that had escaped from that strange place seemed to have become the center of the entire world, the ruler of the great Tao. Even in the face of these profound attacks, his expression did not change at all. As his body trembled, everything in the world seemed to be stirred up along with him. The tentacles that had been subdued by Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth seemed to have been cut by some strange blades. They broke away from the light of heaven and earth bit by bit and returned to the endless river of the great Tao in the outside world. Of course, this was just the background. At this moment, the life form's attack on Luo Fan had yet to subside. Its body emitted a strange brilliance, and an increasingly powerful repulsive force acted on the light of heaven and earth, as well as on Luo Fan's body. It was as if the light of heaven and earth had turned into ordinary light, and there was no special power at all. Immediately after, a tentacle penetrated the barrier of the great Tao in an extremely mysterious manner and quickly shot towards Luo Fan. The number of tentacles was naturally tens of thousands of times less than the countless tentacles from before. However, the pressure that this tentacle brought to Luo Fan was completely incomparable to that of the countless tentacles from before. At this moment, Luo Fan felt as if he was facing the attack of a supreme true saint. It was as if everything in the universe had become his enemy, and everything was being crushed in various ways according to the other party's will. And no matter how he reacted, no matter what method he used to resist, he seemed to be completely unable to break away from this tentacle, and he could not avoid the attack exerted by this tentacle. As the tentacle approached, Luo Fan had a feeling that death was constantly approaching. He could even vaguely see endless space-time hidden in the countless suction cups on the tentacle. There was also an unknown amount of unimaginable power that was constantly brewing, as if it was ready to be released at any time. And the trajectory of this tentacle across the great Tao made him feel as if he had seen it in Pangu's primordial spirit, the moment when Pangu split the heavens and the earth. At this moment, the universe seemed to no longer exist, and all his thoughts and all the scope of his vision were already left with this tentacle. Poof! With a soft sound, this tentacle had already penetrated the barrier of the light of heaven and earth and directly blasted onto Luo Fan's body. And Luo Fan's body completely collapsed at this moment, as if he was just a human figure condensed from smoke. At this moment, the octopus-like creature murmured, "Did I succeed?" At this moment, he already looked extremely miserable. More than 90% of the tentacles around his body had been broken, and there was not a trace of vitality in his body, as if he had just struggled out of death. As for the power of his body, the brilliance in his eyes, and the perfection and power that originally lingered around his body, not a single bit remained. From this state, one could tell at a glance how great a price he had paid to unleash that move from before. However, he clearly really had some kind of relationship with the creator of the world. At this moment, everything in this world, whether it was the great Tao, laws, time, space, or material energy, was constantly gathering towards him and continuously surging into his body, replenishing his consumption and healing all kinds of strange injuries on his body. If it was a normal cultivator, even if his entire body collapsed and was completely erased with this kind of replenishment, he would probably recover completely in an instant. However, this was not the case for this creature at this moment at all. After receiving such replenishment and so many conveniences from this world, this creature just completely absorbed all of them without any changes to his body at all. Perhaps there were changes, but the extent of the changes were clearly too small and the speed was too slow. It seemed as if there were no changes at all. From this, it could be seen just how severe the price he had paid just now was. If I erase him, this world should have more time for me to recover. But why would such an enemy of the world appear? Could it be that I violated some sort of Great Tribulation's rules by delaying the Great Tribulation? The octopus-like creature suddenly looked up at the sky. His gaze was distant, as if he could see through layers of barriers and see some supreme existence beyond the world. The creature murmured, and that tentacle had already been retracted. Immediately afterward, his body squirmed, and spots of blood reappeared on his body. Although his eyes were still dim, his figure had at least somewhat recovered to its original perfect state. Evidently, after recovering a bit of his mental strength, this creature could already readjust his figure. Looking down at the devastated world below, the creature sighed again and hatefully said, "Billions of years of effort turned into bubbles overnight. It's a pity that he's already dead. Otherwise, I'll definitely torture him properly to vent the hatred in my heart." As he spoke, he swung his tentacles and was about to turn around and return to the origin of the great Tao to reconstruct a strange place to contain himself. However, the moment he turned around, he suddenly sensed something. His eyes narrowed, and uncertainty filled his eyes. Chapter 2433. He's not dead. At this moment, a shocking thought flashed through the creature's mind. After all, he had clearly erased all traces of Luo Fan just now. Normally speaking, even the many other creatures in this world should have forgotten about him. This strange light that was completely rooted in Luo Fan, the light of heaven and earth, should naturally dissipate with him. Judging from this, there was clearly only one possibility. Luo Fan was not dead. What he had sensed before, the signs that all traces of existence had been completely erased, was nothing more than his own misconception. After discovering this, how could the creature dare to be careless? Even though he was already dead tired, and even though it was extremely difficult for him to mobilize his power, he still forced himself to summon his strength. His many tentacles danced and stirred up the surrounding great Tao. With a momentum that could destroy heaven and earth, he ruthlessly smashed towards the light of heaven and earth. With this smash, all the power in the world seemed to have been mobilized. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth seemed to be unable to withstand this kind of power. Its structure began to distort violently, and the net that had spread out from the light of heaven and earth was instantly forced back. It was about to be completely pressed back into the light of heaven and earth. At this stage, the great Tao's assimilation and erosion of the net had almost stopped. It was as if all the power of the great Tao had been completely converted into pressure on the net, and it wanted to completely erase the net from its roots. In the creature's eyes, the reason why Luo Fan was not completely dead was clearly because of this extremely strange light that could even rival the will of heaven and earth and the great Tao. In this way, the creature's target was very obvious if it wanted to completely kill Luo Fan. The entire world had originally gradually eased up and was about to gradually return to peace. However, following the will of this living being, not only did the entire world once again sink into the violence and terror from before, it even went a step further, causing all living beings to feel that a certain vital existence within them had been brazenly extracted. They seemed to have become incomparably empty, faintly feeling as if they had turned into an empty shell. Under this pressure, the light of heaven and earth rapidly shrunk. The vortex gradually lost its form and returned to its original form, turning back into a living creature. It kept changing and moving, as if it wanted to find a certain form, but couldn't find the answer. As for the countless threads, they had been completely pushed back into the light of the world. From the looks of it, the situation was extremely dire. However, this change was not entirely a bad thing for the light of heaven and earth. In fact, from a certain point of view, this was a great thing. There was no other reason. As the silk net was pressed into the light of heaven and earth, the world will of this world was also completely enveloped by the silk net. In other words, this terrifying pressure seemed to have completely pushed back the silk net, causing the light of heaven and earth to suffer serious damage. However, this was only on the surface. In reality, the light of heaven and earth had benefited greatly. It had originally had no time or energy to do the work of devouring the world will, but it had been completed in an extremely short period of time. Of course, this was clearly not a big deal for that living being. To that living being, the world was clearly not too important. Even if the world was completely devoured, it would not hesitate as long as it could quickly wipe out Luo Fan. Therefore, it did not regret its actions at all, causing the light of heaven and earth to devour the world even faster. Instead, it further strengthened its control over the power and strengthened the gathering of the power of the entire world. At this moment, every inch of space and time in the entire world seemed to be grabbed and pulled by invisible hands, frantically compressing towards the center. Due to this terrifying pulling effect, the boundaries of the world became blurry, and the originally clear structure at the boundaries became even more chaotic. Boundless great calamity, baleful chi from the outside world crazily attacked the boundaries that had suddenly become weak, causing loud rumbles to ring out from all over the boundaries of the world. The rumbles were extremely strange and massive. When they reached the ears of the living beings, they felt like they were personally witnessing the end of the world. They felt like everything they had was going to collapse in the next moment, and the foundation of their existence would disappear in an instant. An indescribable fear emerged from the bottom of the living beings' hearts. They kept pouring into the great Tao, gradually affecting the great Tao and the various mysteries of the great Tao. It even caused the expression of the living being, who was suspected to be the creator of the world, to change slightly. He had long known that the living beings would affect the foundation of the world, and even affect him. However, the extent of this influence still exceeded his expectations. He even felt his mind suddenly become hazy. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth flashed slightly, and suddenly turned from its originally extremely solid and real state to an illusory one. The boundless mysteries of the great Tao rapidly changed at this moment, wanting to trace the changes of the light of heaven and earth and continue suppressing it. However, it was a pity that the mysteries of the great Tao itself were burdened by the living being. That living being had the will of a living being and the way of thinking of a living being. When fighting with other living beings, he could be more agile and more targeted, thus saving him more effort. However, a living being was a living being, and a living being's will was a living being's will. No matter how powerful he was, before he reached the true divine stage, there was still a gap between him and the world's will and the great Tao's own autonomous reaction. With such a gap in the background, how could he react as quickly as the great Tao when faced with the changes of the light of heaven and earth that had reached the level of complexity of the world's will? In other words, if the living being did not exist, he could only rely on the great Tao itself to respond according to the situation and react accordingly. Then, at this moment, the changes of the light of heaven and earth would definitely not be able to escape the great Tao's control. He would still be suppressed by the great Tao and would not be able to escape its suppression. However, after the existence of this living being, the changes that surpassed the limits of a living being's reaction speed caused the living being to be at a loss. As a result, the great Tao was also unable to do anything to it. In the end, it easily escaped the great Tao's suppression, allowing the boundless great Tao to instantly pass through the light of heaven and earth, as if it was passing through an illusion and violently collided in the middle. Of course, the great Tao was also constantly changing during this process. It traced the changes of the light of heaven and earth in an attempt to come into contact with the true form of the light of heaven and earth. However, it was a pity that the light of heaven and earth was also constantly changing. Because of the living being's burden on the great Tao, the light of heaven and earth's changes were much faster than the great Tao's changes. Hence, although the great Tao was chasing after it, it was always one step ahead, causing the great Tao to be unable to do anything to it. At this moment, a figure slowly appeared within the light of heaven and earth. He sat quietly with his legs crossed, and his expression was calm and collected. It was Luo Fan. Compared to before, Luo Fan no longer felt any urgency. It was as if he had seen through everything and grasped everything. How is this possible? The living being could not help but be dumbfounded when it saw Luo Fan appear there. Although it had already discovered that Luo Fan might not be completely dead, it had only suspected that he was not completely dead. It had never thought that Luo Fan would actually be completely unharmed. In fact, he even seemed to be a lot more confident than before. This situation had already overturned his worldview. He felt as if his understanding of the world and his understanding of cultivation had been completely overturned. So the weakness is so obvious. I actually didn't notice it at all before. A strange expression appeared on Luo Fan's face as he looked at the light of heaven and earth that was changing freely. There was a sense of realization and helplessness on his face. The realization was that he already knew how to defeat this living being, defeat the world, and even devour it. The helplessness was that this method had actually been placed in front of him a long time ago, but he had only discovered it now, when he had died once and relied on the connection between many other planes and reality to resurrect. At this moment, he no longer controlled the light of heaven and earth to fight like before. Instead, he sent his target to the worlds within the light of heaven and earth. Afterwards, he began to wait quietly, allowing the light of heaven and earth to react naturally and choose how to change, as well as how to reach his target. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth shook slightly. Circles of fluctuations were released from his body, continuously spreading in all directions. As this spread, the fluctuations gradually condensed. Unknowingly, they had already transformed into an indescribable state, forming circles after circles of concentric circles that resembled a network, wrapping the wider and wider paths within these concentric circles. With this change, the paths that were wrapped within the concentric circles seemed to have been cut out from the complete path. Pieces of them became isolated and helpless, and the materialized fluctuations began to continuously erode, assimilate, and devour them. In the end, they turned into the fluctuations' nourishment, causing the fluctuations to strengthen and expand once again, enveloping even more paths within them before devouring them. How dare you? The living being turned pale with fright when it saw this. It released its will and tried its best to control the paths, wanting to break the strange network formed by the fluctuations and link all the paths together again. As long as it could do this, The paths would be protected by the complete path and would not be devoured so easily. However, it was a pity that the network of fluctuations was also constantly producing all sorts of indescribable and unimaginable changes. It seemed to completely ignore the resistance of the paths. With just the various subtle changes, it had already broken free from the resistance of the paths. It was not affected at all as it devoured the paths at its own pace. At the same time, the light of heaven and earth was also dodging the attacks and suppression of the paths. However, similar to the fluctuations, the light of heaven and earth was similarly unfazed by the attacks and suppression of the paths. It could not have dealt with them more easily. A faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face as he watched this development. He slowly closed his eyes and immersed his mind in the light of heaven and earth. He began to follow the process of the light of heaven and earth as it absorbed the paths, constantly comprehending the mysteries and principles revealed in the process. Changes similar to the previous world appeared in the light of heaven and earth. Countless broken lines gradually appeared within the light of heaven and earth. They quickly swam about, trying their best to link together and form a more orderly, grander, and mysterious pattern. However, this was nothing to Luo Fan. After devouring the will of heaven and earth, he no longer had any worries. Coupled with the fact that he had discovered the weaknesses of the paths, he did not need to do anything else. Naturally, there was no need for him to waste any more time. He naturally wanted to obtain as many benefits as possible from the process of the light of heaven and earth devouring the paths. Endless mysteries and principles continued to fuse into his heart, gradually turning into all kinds of subtle comprehensions. Bit by bit, they perfected his worldview of laws, transforming his worldview of laws, allowing his worldview of laws to slowly approach the true sage level. In the process of comprehending, time seemed to have lost all meaning. After an unknown period of time, perhaps it had already been 1,000,000,000,000 years, or perhaps it had only been a few days. At a certain moment, Luo Fan suddenly felt that the comprehensions that were constantly being transmitted from the light of heaven and earth had gradually disappeared. It's over. With a slight jolt in his heart, Luo Fan slowly opened his eyes and looked outside. He could not help but smile when he saw what was happening. This was because, just as he had expected, there was only a thin layer of the great Tao left in this world. This layer was tightly wrapped around the surface of the living being's body, vaguely forming a protective circle at this time. The creature was looking at Luo Fan with an incomparable shock, fear, and hatred in its eyes, as well as the ball of light on the surface of his body, which had been enlarged by who knew how many tens of thousands of times. It felt as if it could blot out the sky and cover the earth. With a slight calculation, Luo Fan knew that millions of years had passed since he started to comprehend the boundless profundities and principles revealed by the light of the heavens and the earth. After knowing the time, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. I didn't expect you to not react after such a long time. It seems that even if you're related to the creator of this world, you're probably just a trace of aura.